Kageno is an ugly, disputing loser who pretends to be weaker than your pull-out game. However, he's actually an overpowered Dark Lord with a harem of powerful assassins who help him clap every night. But before this, Kageno was still living his first life as a worthless background character in the real world, where he dreamt of becoming some kick-ass vigilant by enrolling in the MMA and beating the crap out of local thugs every night. At school, a certified pick-me girl, Akane, would always try to befriend him, despite his obvious reluctance. She did this because Kageno was the only one at school who didn't practically worship her. And since she was a showbiz actress and a filthy rich spoiled bitch, this didn't sit well with her. In reality, however, her people-pleasing antics stemmed from a trauma she suffered as a child actress some years ago when she got kidnapped by gangsters and was assaulted. Now, with her PTSD, she tries to play everyone's dream girl so she can hide her own bitterness behind her smile. One night, after spending the entire day working on the upcoming school festival, Akane waited for her driver to pick her up, only for that to never happen. With no other option left, she walked back home, something the so-called princess hadn't done since the kidnapping incident. What she didn't know was that her poor driver was getting his ass whooped by some gangsters somewhere while another bunch of those jobless thugs were coming to get her. Soon enough, Akane was surrounded too, and while the thugs knocked her out with a drug-soaked handkerchief, she saw Kageno, who was out on his daily criminal hunting stroll. When she came to, Akane found herself in an abandoned building where the kidnappers revealed they'd let her go as soon as they received ransom money from her cash cow parents. However, things soon got out of hand when one of those thugs forced himself on Akane and bitch slapped her for resisting him, triggering all her past traumas. However, just as she began crying, Kageno made a heroic entrance and introduced himself as the stylish ruffian slayer. True to his lame-ass name, Kageno easily condemned the first ruffian to hell. However, the next guy proved to be a challenge. This Chica Chad turned out to be an ex-militant, which weirdly turned on Kageno as he had always wanted to fight one. As their fight began, the jock initially took the upper hand using a dagger, but Kageno eventually showed him why he was the protagonist, by using crowbars to restructure his ugly face. With both of them dead, Kageno freed Akane and vanished, only to wallow in his misery and lack of strength later. Meanwhile, Akane's rich parents covered up the incident. However, no one could ever find the masked vigilant, aka Kageno's real identity. The next day, when Akane greeted him, Kageno used her correct name, meaning that he now respected her as a person. However, since this wasn't a rom-com, their budding relationship died within numbered days as Kageno got into an accident and lost his life. In his final moments, he realized even his power had limits, and if a nuclear war were ever to break, his edgy ass would turn into smoked beef in a second. However, thanks to Truck-Kuman's intervention, Kageno was reincarnated in a fantasy world with unparalleled magic power and a harem of hot elf girls who simped after him for kicks. Now, as the mastermind behind an underworld crime-hunting organization, Kageno finally became the wannabe vigilant working in the shadows he had always wanted to be. However, he still decided to play the background character and hide his true identity and strength for kicks. In this parallel universe, Kageno was born to a hot mama and a loser dad in a family that trained dark knights for the kingdom. He even had an elder sister who was drastically stronger than him, but only for the show since the real MVP had always been him, hiding in the shadows and wreaking havoc upon weaklings who dared to cross his path. Kageno's new power provided him with a slimy body coat that he could shape-shift into weapons and practically anything that he wanted, and he used it to show ugly losers their rightful place in hell. He mostly did it for the money because in this economy who wouldn't? Anyway, during one of his usual night hunts, Kageno came across a weirdly disgusting blob of meat and decided to use it as his punching bag for as long as it would last. However, while he was doing so, this blob of meat turned into a hot-as-hell elf one day, and he immediately changed his course of action. As this chick came back to her senses, Kageno flashed an edgy pose and pretended to be some overlord who had just saved her from a curse. He further fed her some made-up bullshit about a demon Lord Diablo, whose subjects turned her into a slimy monster, because she was one of the 3 descendants of the heroes that put the demon lord away. Knowing that his shit was being sold, Kageno took a step forward and updated his name from the wannabe ruffian slayer to Shadow, and invited her to join his cult to hunt Diablo. The dumb elf, whom he named Alpha, immediately believed him and swore her life to protect him. From then onward, Kageno's ad-libbing won him simps over simps, and he eventually turned them into his personalized fan club called the Shadow Garden. Meanwhile, he continued to live the life of a loser by deliberately losing to his elder sister Claire, who always pretended to be better than him. Later, as she turned 15, Claire was supposed to be sent to the Academy of Dark Knights. However, on the day of her departure, she went missing. Kageno's harem deduced it was the doing of Diablo's cult that must have misunderstood Claire for the descendant of a hero, while Kageno himself thought his brainwashing was making them take every local thug for a cult member. Either way, his Oscar-worthy acting skills help him play along, and his gang decides to locate and hunt the kidnappers at night. Meanwhile, Claire, who is being held captive, gets weirdly outraged when the kidnapper mentions going after Kageno, finally revealing her bro-con colors. However, the kidnapper simply sucker punches her into oblivion and reveals he wants to test her blood for a ritual, only for his grand scheme to get spoiled by Kageno and Ko's entrance. It turns out that Kageno's bullshit stories are actually true, and that these steroid-pumped jocks are members of Diablo's cult, trying to revive him. Alpha and the girls attack the kidnapper, but he flees the scene, only to face Kageno's plot armor-pumped ass later. He easily dodges the attacks of this 6-foot-something militant, and with a few slashes of his sword, makes a jigsaw puzzle out of him. The kidnapper gets even more high on his power-amping drugs, but even after going full Super Saiyan, he still loses to Kageno. Later, Claire returns home on her own and sets out to the Night Academy. With her gone, Kageno believes he can finally relax a little, only for all hell to break loose when Alpha and the girls reveal they have decided to part ways with him and pursue their individual lives. Kageno wonders where he went short on his ruse, but the girls promise to still be connected with him as long as they are after Diablo and his cult. A few years pass and Kageno travels to the capital to enroll at the night school as well. However, since he still needs to continue playing the role of a loser, he tries his hardest to stay away from the limelight. He stays at the shabbiest dorm, befriends the lamest weebs in existence, and makes weird bets to embarrass himself and uphold his background character image. One morning, his friends force him to keep his word and pay the penalty for losing a bet, which involves confessing his love to the school's head girl, Princess Alexia, who has never agreed to date anyone and has trampled on the ego of anyone who dared to confess to her. Kageno's masochistic ass confesses to her while stuttering and spitting. However, his grand scheme ends up in the gutter when she actually says yes to him and reroutes him to the path of a rom-com protagonist. His friends are just as surprised at where he got all this ruse from. The following day, Alexia even joins them for lunch, and thanks to her heavy pocket, the cheapskates get to taste meat for the first time in a while. Kageno, who wants her to dump him so he can revert to his old, insignificant life, gobbles it all up, only to find that she's rather enjoying the sight. Later, she drags him to her fencing lessons where Zenon, the head of the Royal Knights, is the instructor. He preaches to them some crap about fighting for the greater good, but Kageno is rather focused on Alexia's peculiar style of sword fighting. He notices that she sticks to the rules and has nothing all that great about her technique, something that he likes. Later, he overhears a conversation between her and Zenon and realizes they are engaged. Deducing that the bitch is merely two-timing him despite Zenon, Kageno tries to break up with her, only to realize the snakes he has for friends have already told her about their bet and his fake confession. Alexia threatens him into staying her side chick, but none of her warnings work as well as her shimmering gold coins do, in front of which Kageno wiggles his tail like her faithful dog. From then on, even though everyone calls him a gold digger, Kageno sticks to Alexia's side to fight inflation, something that begins to piss off Zenon. Later, as she bitches about him on the train, Kageno quietly listens to her, but later asks why she doesn't want to marry him despite him being the perfect husband material. Alexia says he's far too perfect, which makes her suspicious of whether he's hiding his flaws or is just plain psychotic. A few days later, on their way back home, Alexia trash talks Kageno's fencing style and calls it plain, but Kageno says he likes her style despite hers being just as plain and uninteresting. This triggers her for some reason, and after bitching about how she's always wanted to be as great as her prodigal sister and that she hates his guts, Alexia gets off the train. However, karma catches up to her and she gets kidnapped on her way home. The next day, Zenon captures Kageno as the prime suspect in her kidnapping, something he doesn't resist against. Meanwhile, Alexia finds herself captivated in a prison cell somewhere, right next to a weird, ugly entity. Just as she assumes it was Kageno's doing, a mad scientist walks in, thirsting for her royal blood. Upon being questioned, he reveals he'll use it to resurrect the Demon King. On the other hand, Zenon's cocky henchmen assault Kageno very harshly, but his sadistic ass is rather pleased about it. In fact, since both these small fries seem exceptionally stupid, Kageno mentally competes with them in a battle of who can act more stupid. Back at the Nutjob's lab, he fails to drain enough blood from Alexia and takes it out on the ugly entity, only for Alexia to bring his attention back to her to keep her safe. This doesn't age well, since he then makes her eat literal vomit, which drains her wanted humanitarian self quickly. Back at the academy, Zenon meets with Alexia's elder sister, Iris, who is the princess of the state, and they devise strategies to locate and rescue her sister. The Broken, on the other hand, has a mental breakdown upon learning about Kageno's capture, and tries hard to leave the dormitory to rescue him. A few evenings later, after Kageno is sent home freely, he notices a few sus men tailing him, only for Alpha to quietly take care of them. She later greets Kageno in his bedroom and reveals that she came back as soon as she learned that he was in trouble. Kageno, who never expected to see her again, is surprised to learn she's still working on extending his shadow garden, and is taken aback even more when she deduces Alexia was captured by the demonic cult too. Alpha's simping doesn't stop here, and she quietly lays him down, begins to strip him, and asks about his romance with Alexia, something she's clearly salty about. However, she quietly leaves when he promises it was only for show, and informs him Beta will be coming to meet him soon. To greet Beta, he brings out all the vintage paintings and aged wine he has procured from his side hustle as a thief and faithful dog, and it works wonders when she walks into his dorm and hears him talking in his deep Batman voice. The simp is instantly hot and bothered to witness Kageno in all his glory, and reveals that she and the rest of his girlies plan to revolt against the call tonight. Later, as he kickstarts this self-imposed mission, two more of Zenon's men try to frame him by planting Alexia's scent all over him, only for Kageno to mop the floor with their blood, something Beta takes notes of. As Kageno's cult begins its mission, so does Iris's team. They both try to locate Alexia's position. On the other hand, the mad scientist returns to Alexia's cell and injects the entity with her blood. Hoping to awaken the Demon Lord, however, this Frankenstein experiment fails and the entity turns into a bloodthirsty monster, instead who first and foremost turns him into mincemeat. Surprisingly, she doesn't hurt Alexia and instead breaks her chains, before heading out to the city to play Japanese Godzilla. Later, as Alexia steps out of the prison cell, she's disgusted to find Zenon's filthy face and realizes he's the one who kidnapped and tortured her. On the other hand, since he knows how to push her buttons, he compares her inferior blood to Iris, which blows her fuse. However, since this is a Naruto, her emo-amped power-up doesn't work. Alexia loses her fight against Zenon. Knowing she's done for, Alexia prays for a miracle, and the miracle arrives in the shape of Kageno. After delivering a speech full of bullshit, Kageno makes his appearance and Zenon immediately recognizes him as the masked vigilant who hunts at night. Thinking he's something, Zenon arrogantly belittles Kageno and charges at him. However, Kageno makes him eat his words. Just as his dumb face stares back at him, the Japanese Godzilla breaks free and wreaks havoc in the city. The measly knights under Iris's command try to hold her back, only to be spat away like mere flies. Iris plays the hero and slashes through the monster, only to realize it can heal itself even after losing an entire limb. This joke of a princess then tries to dice it up to keep it from regenerating itself. However, even that fails and forces Alpha to intervene. This elven queen immediately realizes that the monster wants to be exorcised and uses one swift move to completely obliterate it, setting it free. With the monster gone and Alpha victorious, Iris becomes a certified elf simp and asks her name, but Alpha tells her to sit back and enjoy the show. On the other hand, the wannabe king of swag gets high on some steroids to fight Kageno, but even so, Kageno easily defeats him. He then triggers him on purpose by mocking his big mouth, which forces him to take even more pills. The resulting exchange of blows between their swords makes Alexia realize that despite being extremely powerful, Kageno's technique is very plain and simple, similar to her technique. On the other hand, after suffering yet another defeat at Kageno's hands, Zenon puts on his final Halloween costume and calls himself the Chosen One, only for Kageno to use his ultimate atomic-level attack and annihilate him. As the sparks from his attack shine all over the city, all his fangirls feel butterflies from afar, while Alexia swings her sword around once Zenon is obliterated and Kageno leaves. Soon, her useless sister arrives and embraces her, glad to find her alive, and the two put their family issues to bed. The next day, Alexia meets up with Kageno at school and thanks him for praising her fencing style, and with blushing cheeks, asks if they can continue to date for a little longer. Our Jigga Chad curtly rejects her, making her unleash her sword at him in retaliation. Meanwhile, Kageno's harem, which still hasn't recovered from his dashing power moves, discusses the pressing issue of an impersonator claiming to be Shadow Garden and decides to obliterate it. On the other hand, Iris, who suspects Zenon's involvement in Alexia's abduction, creates his separate order of knights, independent of those working under him. In addition, she uncovers a relic that she claims would lead her to Diablo's cult, to decipher which an airhead Pinkett joins their school. On her first day, however, she crashes against Kageno, who has just survived Alexia's wrath, and falls in love at first sight. Over the next few days, masked vigilantes unalive people all over town in the name of Shadow Garden, while Kageno swears to his cultured friends that he's still a virgin after his breakup becomes official. The lame guys eventually force him to come along with them to visit a local superstore, which is the city's newest sensation. Meanwhile, Sherry the new Pinkett agrees to help Iris uncover how to use the relic she found after raiding a facility belonging to Diablo's cult. Back in the city, Kageno and co. arrive at their destination only to find a long-ass queue. While they wait for their turn, Kageno takes a look around and finds that this new store is eerily similar to the stuff he remembers from his past life. Suddenly, a hottie shows up and takes Kageno away for a survey, making the other two wonder when his lame ass became such a chick magnet. On the other hand, this girl brings Kageno to a lavish dream house where he finds one of his subordinates, Gamma. She reveals that she used all the knowledge he bestowed upon her to create this superstore that is making her millions, making him wonder how some measly bullshit he sprouted to appear cool turned into this piece of heaven. However, since Gamma is a genius, it doesn't take him by too much surprise. Later, she asks Kageno to take the throne she has prepared for him, but trips on her way and gets a nosebleed. As he settles on that pedestal soon afterward, Kageno's inner child squeals at how much of a king he feels like, but he acts like a tough jock and rewards all his subjects with a sparkling shower since his broke ass can't afford anything else. Gamma, who like every girl is satisfied with his bare minimum, calls it the best day of her life and shows him the billion gold coins she has garnered in revenue. Kageno breaks into a cold sweat since he has never seen so much money in his life, but he acts tough and asks Gamma about the recent copycat incidents. Gamma presents him with a theory that makes him wonder if the one behind it is Alexia, given her history of violence. When Kageno takes his leave, Gamma introduces him to Nu, one of the newest additions in her chick club, and assigns her to assist him. Before leaving, Kageno asks Gamma to give him 3 packs of chocolates and even steals a few coins to cure his poverty. At night, while he and his pals return to the dorm, Kageno senses a presence nearby and uses nature's call as an excuse to go after it. However, what he discovers proves he's just another dumb idiot who pretends to be cool. Instead of Alexia playing Shadow Garden, he finds that she's being hunted by the unknown imposter who claims to be them. Instead of helping her right away, Kageno, being the gentleman that he is, sits back and enjoys while the damsel deals with multiple vigilantes at once. However, when things get out of hand, he intervenes and condemns them to hell. This doesn't sit right with Alexia's communist ass, and she asks him why he doesn't use his power for the greater good. Kageno tells her to shut up before he leaves and she collapses. He then goes after the other wannabe thugs and hands them over to Nu for interrogation. When news about their death reaches the enemy's headquarters, their leader, who is a goblin slayer fanatic, tells his minions to prioritize retrieving the stolen relic instead of holding their funerals. Later, as Alexia tells Iris about the fake Shadow Garden, Iris tells her she cares about neither the cult nor the underworld, but wants to protect her own kingdom. The following day, Kageno and the 2 idiots play Confessing to Hot Chicks Round 2, and although both the losers get beaten by the girls' boyfriends, Kageno's Reese captures Cherry's heart, whom he gives his chocolates to just to get through with it. As her Delulu ass later fantasizes about a future with Kageno, while eating the sweets, her adoptive father calls it love at first sight, and believes Kageno must be crazy about Sherry to bring her something so expensive. The following day, Nu joins the school as an undercover student and informs Kageno that the lunatic they captured hasn't spoken up about the copycat Shadow Garden yet. She further explains how most of the cult followers have been drugged and brainwashed, except Rex, who is their only named soldier. Kageno, who is done with all this bullshit, believes there's a bigger reason why these imposters are posing as his organization and tells Nu to investigate. Later, his idiot friends reveal to Kageno that they have entered him in the upcoming Bushin Festival, so he can get popular with the ladies and help bed one of them too. During the festival, Claire smokes some weaklings to release her pent-up frustration, while the certified side characters try to make a fortune from gambling, however, to no avail. As their bank accounts pile up a negative balance, Kageno faces Rose, a warrior princess in his first match, and realizes he has to get his ass whooped if he wants to win the Best Side Character award. They charge at each other as the match begins, and although Kageno has multiple possibilities to strike at Rose, he chooses to swallow some fake blood and get smoked. As he plummets on the ground, the referee announces Rose as the winner, only for Kageno to stand back up and claim he can fight some more. Rose defeats him once again, but he keeps standing back up like some emo-amped side character with a sad backstory and earns Rose's respect. She eventually uses her secret power move to finally defeat him, but ends up joining his simp club. As he is taken to the infirmary and bandaged like a mummy, a starry-eyed Sherry shows up before him and takes him out on a date. She offers him some handmade cookies, while Kageno wonders how he ended up on this rom-com path again. Sherry, who believes he wants to marry her, tells Kageno she'd rather start as friends before sleeping together. Just as he agrees to that, she brings out her adoptive father, who is the head of the kingdom's research department. At this point, Kageno realizes he has messed up by affiliating with potential main characters and decides to take a few days off. That evening, Sherry can't help but fantasize about Kageno again and later visits Alexia to inquire about her relationship with him, simply because she's jealous. After learning that they have broken up, Sherry delightfully announces she can freely date him now, much to Alexia's displeasure. Since she still likes Kageno, Alexia gets a seizure from imagining those two together, but pretends to be a tough, cold-hearted bitch. A few days later, as Kageno rejoins school, Rose shows up to their class and talks about some upcoming election. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer copycat uses an antique relic to cast a barrier around the school. Kageno realizes something is off, but when he tries to use his magic, he finds that it doesn't work. Right then, the cult-suited vigilantes break into their classroom and tell everyone to get on their knees, only for Rose to refuse. She pulls out her sword and tries to act like a hero, however, she has no idea her magic won't work on the opponent. So right before she gets screwed, Kageno butts in and shields her, only to be discarded as his side piece himself. On the bright side, Rose's delusions upgrade and she starts believing he is smitten with her enough to lay his life in her service. Although everyone believes he's done for, Kageno is just thrilled to finally have terrorist attack stories to flex before his grandchildren. Later, as the cult's leader locks up all the students in the auditorium, while his lackeys search for the relic in Sherry's possession, Kageno comes back to life and finds a way to use his magic by releasing it in small proportions. Meanwhile, just as Sherry finally finds out how to decode the relic, the nutjob, Rex breaks into her room through the window and tells her he's here to steal the relic for his boss in exchange for being allowed to wreak as much havoc as he can. He swings his sword at her, and just as he thinks she's game over, her guard dog shows up and claims he can whoop his weak ass. As Sherry escapes and leaves everything to him, Kageno observes the chaos from the rooftop, typical for a powerful Dark Lord, pissed at the fact that these copycats attacked in broad daylight despite calling themselves shadows. He further notices all their methods are exactly by the book, and they've clustered all the hostages in an auditorium, where he assumes their leader must be. However, since striking before dawn isn't his style, Kageno sticks to attacking them from the shadows and wipes out unit after unit. Suddenly, he finds the pink idiot running around the hallways completely exposed and secretly saves her dumbass by wiping out everyone who targets her. When it's time to finally make his appearance, he shows up as her knight in shining armor and catches her as she trips. Surprised to see the blood stain on his clothes, she asks if he needs to be rushed to a hospital, but he acts tough and instead lectures her about her carelessness. They later head to safety in a library, where Kageno realizes Sherry is the MC of this arc, but wonders where her sidekick is. Later, her big brains tell him about the relic the enemy is using to block their magic, and show that the one in her possession can be used to block its effects. She also explains how the relic only absorbs the magic it has been exposed to before, and Kageno realizes he can use small-frequency magic because it's practically undetectable. Upon learning that the relic can only function in places where magic energy is concentrated, Kageno realizes that the relic is currently in the auditorium, and the two form a tag team to first decode the relic and second, and then stop the Goblin Slayer's grand scheme. As Kageno goes back to her study to retrieve the instruments for the first part of their plan, the cult's leader trash talks Rex about how much of a shithead he is for not being able to overpower a single weak, good-for-nothing bitch. Rex tells him he needs to watch his own ass since half of his army has already been wiped out before he heads back to find Sherry. However, as soon as he gets back inside the building, his minions disappear and Kageno greets him with a punch to his sorry face, since he can't see Kageno thanks to his speed. This wimp casts a magic net around himself to keep him at bay, only to find Kageno right in the heart of his defenses. As this self-proclaimed supervillain turns into Kageno's soccer ball, he ends up in a church full of the corpses of his comrades and begins to lose his sanity. Right then, Kageno appears from behind him and adds him to his corpse party. Meanwhile, New gathers info at Sherry's office. She finds one of her guards there who happens to be her ex-fans. Pissed off at their breakup, she pulls out a blade to finish him off, only to be interrupted by Kageno, who is there to gather instruments to tune the relic. New informs him that his girlies have already infiltrated the school and will be ready to attack as soon as he signals them, and Kageno tells her to do nothing until the relic is prepped up. Later, while Sherry finally makes herself useful, the students locked up in the auditorium begin to grow restless. The knights under Iris's command hesitate to break in because they suspect there might be more rats within the building, while New signals Gam to stay put. Rose, on the other hand, worries they would still pretty much flunk it before the evil cult lord, even if they did break in. On the other hand, Sherry manages to activate the relic and takes Kageno to the auditorium via a secret passage her father told her about. His cinephile ass loves the thrill of playing James Bond, but Sherry is reminded of how brutally her mother was unalived in there by none other than her shithead adoptive father, whom she blindly ignored in hopes of at least keeping a daddy. After Sherry heads to the auditorium via this pathway, some lunatics at the hostage site shoot their guns at the poor students, a sight that amuses their sadistic psycho leader. However, the wimp Rose refuses to take action because she's too busy pissing her pants. Sherry watches all this bloodshed and, in a fit of rage, throws the relic up in the air. It instantly reacts to the one in the cult leader's hand and wipes out the barrier. With their magic back in action, Rose wipes out a bandit and inspires the others to fight back. As chaos ensues, both teams come at each other's throats and Rose struggles against the number of attackers targeting her. However, just as she thinks she's cooked, Kageno makes yet another cool entrance and praises Rose's swordsmanship. This blind bitch also doesn't recognize he's the loser Kageno plays at school. Meanwhile, Kageno and co. overwhelm the cult with their power, so much so that the wimpy leader tries to flee. Kageno notices this, but before he reacts, the shithead sets the entire school on fire. After Rose barely evacuates the students, Iris finally shows up but still proves to be just as useless. On the other hand, Sherry tries to look for her father, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the cult leader heads to Sherry's study and sets her books on fire. It turns out that the Goblin Slayer wannabe was Sherry's shithead father all along, something that Kageno already guessed. When asked about why he's doing this, like every villain ever, he recites his sob story. It turns out that he was once at the top of the sword fighting game, but an injury knocked him off the charts. Now he's salty about this and is basically throwing a tantrum. This shameless guy even goes on to boast how he got rid of Sherry's mother simply because her dumbass was getting in his way, and later invites Kageno to a battle of fists when he makes it clear he doesn't give two shits about him or his past. One move from the edgy old man sends Kageno to the afterlife, only for him to be resurrected as the evil Dark Lord he truly is. Witnessing his unparalleled ruse, the man realizes he'd be done for unless he uses steroids. Once high, he turns into Voldemort with hair, but Kageno simply stands and dodges all his attacks, and eventually cuts him all up. As he meets the same end as Sherry's mother, the dumb pinkette walks in and loses her mind, mourning the douchebag that orphaned her in the first place. Meanwhile, Kageno walks away without telling her the truth. The following day, Kageno becomes an international villain on the news front page, something that doesn't sit right with Alpha and his other bitches. Meanwhile, Sherry approaches him as their racist school finally closes for good and reveals that she's leaving for another city to focus on her research. When Kageno asks why so, she says it's a secret, and the two bid farewell to each other. Over the next few days, Kageno enjoys his life of solitude after evading his pestering sister, and receives a letter from Alpha, inviting him to a holy land somewhere. Meanwhile, his gang of simps extends to the literal half-bitch Delta and Epsilon, who doesn't believe flat is justice. In fact, with the slimy power Kageno granted her, she turns her plums into watermelons to give Beta's curds a competition. This natural beauty, on the other hand, spends her time writing and fan fiction with Kageno as the male lead of her dreams. However, when she hits writer's block, Beta is left with no choice but to head outside and face Epsilon in a battle of assets. Unfortunately, since being slimy isn't Epsilon's #1 quality, she uses her nasty bitchy personality to argue that Kageno has been thirsting after her more often than her, simply thanks to her juicer melons. Although Beta doesn't agree, their argument is cut short when Nu shows up and informs them of news from Alpha. Meanwhile, Gamma meets with Iris and Alexia at her department store and helps them shop for Alexia's upcoming guest appearance at a competition in the Holy Land. She also lets them suck on some premium chocolate balls out of courtesy, and later helps Alexia pick out some hot undergarments from her panty heaven. However, Iris believes Alexia shouldn't be exposing so much of her skin, making Alexia convince her otherwise by showing off her perfectly plump peaches and rizzing her up against the wall. On the other hand, the newest addition to Kageno's fan club, Rose accompanies him to the Holy Land while fantasizing about saving him from an arsonist's attack and giving him her whole heart. However, Kageno isn't all that excited about some bitch-sucking faces with him and eventually pushes her away for his much-needed personal space. Walker Delulu continues to go on and on about their upcoming grand wedding ceremony and 3 future kids. Kageno researches the local religion, the divine teachings and its beliefs about the 3 legendary heroes who descended to the Holy Land years ago. When they reach the Holy Land, Rose takes Kageno to a local market, where he finds a keychain symbolizing how the greatest of the 3 heroes, Olivier, cut off Diablo's left arm. She also informs him that this legendary hand has been sealed in the ruins of some place called the Sanctuary nearby, and later takes him on a book haul. To Kageno's surprise, her favorite rom-com author turns out to be Beta, who is currently selling a pirated version of the Cinderella story for millions. He still gets her autograph but questions his shitty brain for not using his own wisdom to make money, unlike Gamma and Beta. Later, as he compares her autograph with Rose's, they realize Beta has written his in an ancient language that Kageno somehow covers up. Meanwhile, an edgier version of Alpha infiltrates the local church, only to find that the Archbishop has been eliminated, along with his minions. This makes her question what he was hiding, but she leaves right before she gets captured. At night, Kageno watches over the city like some supervillain while he innocently eats some ice cream, and later turns completely sadistic as he uses the ice cream stick to slice an imposter in 3. Right then, Epsilon shows up and tries to get his attention by showing off her bouncy melons. However, the tough guy is more interested in getting information on their ongoing mission than some slime implants. After hearing her report, Kageno says he'll carry out his side of the mission however he wants and leaves. The next evening, he heads to the local hot springs to enjoy some peace away from his annoying fangirls, only to find the pioneer of his harem soaking wet at the same inn. Although Kageno completely ignores her existence, Alexia can't believe her luck for crossing paths with him butt naked after buying all those expensive panties. However, being a cultured woman, she also can't help but ogle at his physique and says she's glad he's alive after getting injured so badly. While attempting to continue their small talk, Alexia reveals she's in the Holy Land to attend the upcoming goddess's trial and learns Kageno is only here as an accidental tourist, without actually knowing about how the event goes. She explains that the chosen warriors basically summon strong emperors from the past and fight them, something that Kageno isn't all that interested in. Realizing this, Alexia mentions she's disappointed in how her juicy assets aren't winning any of his attention, and Kageno explains he likes to keep his eyes to himself at hot springs. Instead, he asks her to stop ogling his Excalibur. Alexia mocks him for being delusional and calling some measly worm an Excalibur. However, she's instantly proven wrong when he stands up and flashes his sausage at her. After he leaves, the poor girl is left distraught and questions her entire existence. The next day, as the trial begins, the new Archbishop kickstarts the ceremony with a long, boring speech, while Alexia internally curses the Baldy for ignoring the previous bishop's death, almost as if it never happened. She further recalls how he canceled their inspection and humiliated her just hours ago, which further infuriates her. However, her attention immediately gets stolen by Beta, or rather her huge size, when she's introduced as the guest of honor, following the success of her novels. Expectedly, the crowd roars when she bends down and flashes her assets, while Alexia's insecure ass feels mad about not receiving the same treatment. Beta's smug jealousy toward Alexia for being Kageno's ex doesn't help either, and the bad blood between the ladies becomes obvious very early on. Their bickering fades into the background when Rose is introduced, right after which the trial begins. The puny first contender, who looks like he hasn't worked a day in his life, calls out to the ancient warriors only for no one to answer his calls. As he drags his weak ass back to the chambers, an arrogant, sturdy knight takes his spot, only to meet the same fate. Meanwhile, Kageno watches this from the stage and imagines himself making a flashy entrance in the middle of the game like every edgy weeb ever. He also struggles with wanting to take the field to clap everyone's asses, and needing to sit back and play the best extra he possibly can. However, his fantasy turns to dust when the announcer suddenly calls out his name as one of the participants. Meanwhile, his ladies infiltrate the entire city to get info and to stay stationed at their specific locations. Back at the Colosseum, everyone trash talks Kageno and expects him to be yet another wimp who'd only get smoked by the ghosts, making him struggle between wanting to run away and embarrass himself later and staying and exposing his identity. Eventually, he decides to distract the audience with a flash of light and makes his appearance as his shady alter ego, completely sure it'll boost the show's views. After sprouting his typical introductory bullshit, Kageno summons an ancient ghost to fight him, while the ugly Baldy believes he's too cocky for his own good. However, he eats his words just as the door to heaven opens right on top of the stadium and Hot Baddie appears before Kageno as his opponent. This intimidating lady happens to be the Witch of Calamity, Aurora, who long ago wreaked havoc throughout heaven and earth. Beta, who watches this from the mezzanine, pulls out a notebook from her safe spot and asks the cultured, disgusting Baldy to fill her in with more information, while the other two girls roll their eyes at her shamelessness. However, thanks to this very shamelessness, the Baldy explains how dangerous the witch is and how slim the chances of Kageno's survival are, only for Alexia to contradict him. Being a certified simp, she believes that this trial only summons those who are equal in strength to the opponent, which is why Kageno should be able to hold his ground against Aurora. On the other hand, Kageno feels sparks flying between the two of them as the butterflies in his stomach tell them Aurora feels the same way about sword fighting that he does. Believing that combat is just another way of holding a conversation, Aurora fires her first shot, which Kageno easily evades. Although the ugly Baldy believes Kageno is losing, his fangirls believe he's doing just fine, considering how easily he's evading the attacks. Meanwhile, Kageno continues to simp after the baddie, and eventually breaks her strongest blood web to smithereens, ending the battle right after he slashes through her. Aurora, on the other hand, feels happy about dying because she understands Kageno's love language, but mainly because she's sadistic. As Kageno flees after his mic drop moment, the barrier around the Colosseum suddenly breaks and a weird magic gate splits open, thanks to Alpha and Koa's efforts. Elsewhere, Kageno praises himself for putting on such a great show when suddenly, a similar magic gate opens up in front of him. However, since he doesn't want any more drama for today, he chooses to ignore it, only for the gate to follow him around until he gives in and steps into it. Back in the Colosseum, everyone worries about why this is happening when the bald Pope explains that the sanctuary may have responded to Kageno's immense power. He further says that the gate only opens when somebody seeks it, and that it doesn't need to be manifested physically. He then orders everyone to evacuate the building just as the door begins to open. However, before the ladies can leave, Kageno's gang shows up and asks everyone to behave. Epsilon takes out all of the Baldy's guards as Alpha and Delta step into the gate too. Epsilon, who's the only one left behind, captures the Baldy in hopes of dragging him along and threatens to slice Beta's neck with her sword if either of the princesses tries anything fishy. However, since she has a kink for swords, Beta only makes happy noises, while Alexia believes she couldn't care less whether she lives or not. Suddenly, a masked assassin shows up and slices through her fake melons, completely pushing her buttons. On top of it all, Beta's assets bounce right before her eyes, making her realize she can't get exposed just yet. With the power of slime, she reclaims her womanhood before completely annihilating the assassin. The psycho then makes sure nobody saw her flat board and drags the Baldy through the door, right after which Beta is pulled into it. Alexia and Rose, the only two left behind, also refuse to become side characters and jump into the gate right before it disappears for good. On the other side, the two crash on top of Beta, and Alexia uses this chance to make sure her meaty assets aren't as fake as Epsilon's. Right then, the ruthless Alpha arrives and allows everyone to do whatever they want to. As they move deeper into the sanctuary, Alpha reveals to everyone that the history of Diablos that they know of is as fake as world politics. In fact, the hero Olivia, whose statue they find inside the sanctuary, was a woman who happened to have the exact same face as Alpha. In a fit of rage, the Pope calls her a failed experiment, confirming Epsilon's suspicions about the cult's dark history. Alexia, whose dumbass couldn't pass third-grade math, follows Alpha through the next door to find the truth, only for the elf to disappear together with the image of Olivia. Meanwhile, Kageno finds his beloved eye candy as he walks in and asks whether it was her who summoned him. Aurora, who is tied to a chair, denies this and asks if he can help untie her. Kageno pulls out his sword and slashes through her straitjacket, leaving her fully exposed for fan service. After she puts on her magic clothes, she asks Kageno to team up with her so they can escape this memory prison. When Kageno asks how they'll do it, she says they only need to break its magic core, after which the entire sanctuary would cease to exist. However, the problem is that they cannot use magic since they are close to the heart of this prison, but Kageno says he'll manage just fine without it. On the other hand, Alexia and the others watch Olivia's memories to learn how the cult gathered orphans as guinea pigs in the past to perform experiments on and turn them into creatures with both the heroes and Diablos' blood. Meanwhile, Kageno and Aurora's venture leads them to a greenhouse where they find young Aurora crying. Kageno asks the reason behind it, but the witch believes she probably just pissed her pants at that time. She then bitch slaps herself to break the memory, and they manage to move on to the next one. Back at the laboratory, Alfred explains how Olivia was just one of the many children they implanted the demon cells into, but the baldy reasons that they did it because they needed someone strong to counter Diablos' attack if he were ever to strike. Alfred doesn't buy his shit and explains how the mission they later assigned Olivia wasn't to take down the demon, but to extract more cells from him in order to further the church's experiments. As this memory breaks, they move on to a battlefield where a bunch of weaklings attack the demon at once and manage to steal his arm, something they used in the past to start their drug business. The next memory brings them to the heart of the sanctuary where the demon's arm is sealed, and Alfred explains how the cult later perfected the drugs to create an elixir for immortality. However, since they could only create one demon ball a month, and to gain immortality, needed to consume it at least once a year, only 12 people could have it. In another twist of fate, it turns out that the Pope is one of those 12 shitheads who are still alive thanks to the drugs. Alpha believes they still need to perfect the drug to fix the side effects such as hair fall, for which they need people with Olivia's blood, such as herself. Hearing this, the Baldy finally shows his true colors and breaks free from the restraints, only for Delta to impale him and throw him into the river below them. Epsilon lectures her about being dumb enough to eliminate him before getting information, but Alpha believes he is still alive. True to her suspicion, the worm jumps out with a blob of meat pushing him and separates the group in two, bringing Alpha, Beta, and Delta to a fighting ground where he flashes his Walmart-bought bodysuit. He immediately uses multi-shadow clone jutsu to increase his manpower, but Delta's crazy ass still claps him. However, she soon learns that her magic is vanishing, and the Baldy announces it's because they are at the center of the sanctuary, that their magic is being sealed while his magic is multiplying. Delta, on the other hand, isn't half impressed and charges at him with full force. Meanwhile, as Kageno spends time with Aurora, the two end up being tossed onto the battlefield with the witch landing right on top of his cake. After she helps him up, they find yet another version of baby Aurora crying in the middle of nowhere, and Aurora decides to shut her up for good this time. With Kageno's Excalibur, she tries to unalive her, only to be attacked by some ugly, disgusting zombies. Kageno steps in to save her just in time and later slaughters the Walking Dead army, earning Aurora's praises. He then attacks baby Aurora to break this memory as well. On the other hand, Epsilon ventures into the sanctuary and discovers a library where she and her pals research past experiments. Assuming they won't be able to retain the info or take the books back with them, the girls take pictures of the pages when suddenly their clothes start disappearing, probably for more fan service. Just as Epsilon assumes it's because they can't use their magic properly. Her blobs of slime also retire from her chest, and she makes sure the others never speak of it again, just as she reclaims them. Meanwhile, as Aurora and Kageno end up near the magic core, Delta strips herself and continues to overpower the Baldy, only for him to continue multiplying a number, thinking he can win. However, Delta's psycho ass still annihilates him and manages to break the memory. As the Baldy pisses his pants before Alpha and asks how 100 of his clones could so easily be defeated, she says that 0 multiplied by any number is still 0, which was the IQ of each of his clones. Meanwhile, Kageno and Aurora discover a magic sword that is supposed to break the chains to unlock the core. However, when Kageno attempts to pull out, it rejects him since he isn't the chosen one. With nothing else to do, they give up and decide to just chill. On the other hand, the fat scaredy cat summons Olivia to fight Alpha, but they leave before the fight even begins as their objective of gaining information has been achieved. Just then, the Pope receives info that the core has been infiltrated and comes after the intruders. Meanwhile, Kageno asks Aurora why she wants to disappear, something that'll happen once they break the core. She explains that repeatedly living the painful memories from her past is a little too much for her, and she'd rather break free from them. Kageno nods, calculating that the protagonist of the story must be making his appearance in a bit, only to be utterly disappointed when the Baldy shows up instead. He refuses to let either of the two escape and sends Olivia to finish them both. Aurora, who is aware of how strong she is, asks Kageno to leave, but he refuses, knowing full well that plot armor will save his ass either way. As the battle begins, Olivia's ultra-fast speed begins to pound him hard, something that only makes him grin from the excitement. The hero even manages to slash his arm, but Kageno still refuses to fight back because Olivia lacks a heart, and fighting without a heart-to-heart conversation just isn't his cup of tea. Just as he's about to get beaten again, Aurora steps in and asks him to leave, thanking Kageno for all that he has done for her, only for the Baldy to make fun of how a witch is trying to play the heroine. After hearing some more of their bullcrap, Kageno refuses to be treated like some damsel in distress, only to be fatally attacked by Olivia. However, since he planned to get attacked like this, Kageno uses the narrow distance between himself and Olivia to pull her close and leave a hickey on her neck to make her disappear. Seeing this absolute horror, the Pope asks how Kageno could survive being stabbed in the gut, and he explains he can shift his organs using magic to avoid getting critical hits. This tactic allows him to close the gap between his opponents and himself and counterattack in the best way possible. The Pope asks whether he's right in the head before launching his second counterattack with 100 copies of Olivia. However, even this time around, Kageno uses one swift move to finish them all, just as his magic returns. He explains he solidified his magic until it couldn't get absorbed into the surroundings anymore, and finally managed to manipulate it right now. Pissed off, the Baldy orders even more Olivia clones to attack him, only for him to mop the floor with them. Finally, he uses his atomic energy manipulation to launch his final attack, only to be stabbed in the heart by Olivia. However, this still doesn't faze him, and he manages to destroy the entire sanctuary, including the magic core. Meanwhile, his baddies watch this scene from afar. Sometime later, Kageno wakes up in a garden with his head lying on Aurora's lap and explains to her how he shifted his heart to the right side to survive the attack. Unaware of how medical sciences work, she calls him amusing, only to realize she has started to disappear. In her dying moments, she confesses it was she who summoned him because she wanted to disappear and forget everything. However, now that she has met him, she doesn't want to forget the time she spent with him. Kageno also thanks her for giving him a good time as she caresses his lips and kisses him, before turning into stardust. Meanwhile, as Alexia and the girls wander through the forest, Alexia whines about how weak and worthless she felt throughout this arc, and Rose agrees with her, complaining about how they still know nothing about either the cult or Kageno's syndicate. Beta asks what she plans to do about it, only for Alexia to suggest that the three of them form their own girl squad and gather information they might later be able to use. Beta believes Alexia is too stupid to play any form of Sherlock Holmes, but still joins her. Meanwhile, Alpha learns that the core, the sword, and the sanctuary were all wiped out by Kageno and Simps after how badass he is. She further approves of Beta infiltrating Alexia's wanted girl group and later breaks the unfathomable news of Aurora's true identity. It turns out that Kageno had just made out with the demon Diabolus itself, but Alpha decides to keep it from him, assuming that he already knows. Sometime later, Gamma buys an expensive property loaded with petroleum for a cheap price in hopes of extending her business, while Delta goes off on her own playing a werewolf. Meanwhile, Alexia informs Iris about how the Church of Divine Teachings has been involved with the Demons cult and asks that she eliminate them entirely, but Iris refuses, reasoning that she doesn't have enough influence just yet to convince their father, the king. To gain this influence, however, she wants to participate in an upcoming festival, something that Alexia is worried about, given both the cult and Shadow Garden's antics. Iris's Delulu, on the other hand, says her sword will be undefeated against both these organizations. She also believes that the attacks launched by both Shadow and Alpha were thanks to artifacts and not the real strength. At the same time, as Rose practices her swordsmanship, her heart suddenly hurts and she finds a weird pattern marking her chest. A few days later, as the legendary Bushin Festival begins, Kageno observes all the losers participating in it from a skyscraper and calculates who would win and who wouldn't. He also fantasizes about crossing out another move from his wishlist, anicap, playing a weak, good-for-nothing side character who is actually crazy strong. To make it come true, he visits Kamen and asks that she help him disguise himself to enter the festival. When she asks him why, he refuses to expose his weird fetishes and tells her not to question him. After this, she brings out all the cosplays in her arsenal and uses some 16th century cosmetic surgery to change the shape of his face. He chooses to play an insanely mediocre guy who seems like he hasn't smiled in a few hundred years, and hunches his back to show his lack of confidence. On the first day of the festival, a cocky bitch with a bad case of hair dye gone wrong, who happens to be the champion of the decade, stops him in his tracks and tells him to forfeit the match since he's a weakling who would never win. Kageno ignores her warning but feels butterflies in his stomach upon realizing that his disguise is working perfectly. However, this annoying bitch isn't alone and has a bunch of simps following after her, one of whom is a sturdy jock who is a complete headcase. Although one look at him tells Kageno he's the king of losers, this guy thinks he's something and tells Kageno to do as Anaros says he should. This allows Kageno to flash his most baddest line, yet as he claims he's at least stronger than the third-rate lackey, only to piss him off. In a fit of rage, he punches Kageno and sends him flying, but he stays unharmed and calls him a weakling. This triggers his insensitive ass ever more, and he pounds him into the ground, only to stop when Anaros tells him to. Thinking he has learned his lesson, she tells Kageno to forfeit now, only to be stunned to see him uninjured. This forces her to apologize to him for not holding back the jock earlier, but Kageno calls her a pretentious bitch who should mind her own business. Later, as he waits in a line just outside the festival grounds, he flashes weird poses out on the streets, wondering if he has claimed his spot as the dark horse just yet, and recalls the day before. While they had some lunch, his lame friend, Skell from school, told him the favorite to win this year was probably Princess Iris. On his way back home, he came across Rose, who told him she'd be returning home for a bit to finally get engaged to her potential fiancé, Ashtat. She further discussed how Alexia and Beta do not get along together at all, and Kageno assumes it's because both of them are equally freaky and annoying. Before she left, Kageno offered her a burger he bought for takeout and asked her to relax her stiff shoulders. Touched, Rose requested that he believe in her and the fact that she'll serve the people of her kingdom well, and Kageno agreed. Back in the present, he watches the first round of the festival with his dumb pal who is wasting all his money by placing bets on losers. Just then, Goldie, the unbeaten champion of the last decade, drags his freak show to Skell and shows off his glittery ass, claiming he can judge all the participants by the look on their faces. When it's Kageno's turn, he claims that he only has about 30 units of strength compared to the 1,300 he assigns to his buff opponent. However, he ends up clowning himself when the buff guy trips and falls on his own feet, and Kageno becomes the winner. In reality, it was Kageno who punched him in the face, only that he did it so fast that no one could see a thing. Anaros, on the other hand, saw a glimpse of what happened and realized her pea-sized brain couldn't fathom this anomaly anymore. The following morning, Skell shows up to Kageno's inn uninvited, with the groundbreaking news of Rose's disappearance. On the other hand, Alexia and Beta also learn of the news that Rose stabbed her fiancé before fleeing, and although Beta wants them to proceed with caution, given the status of her fiancé, Alexia's impatient ass wants to jump right in and rescue her before she's locked up for a crime. In fact, when Beta argues against her idiotic and reckless plans, she grabs her by the collar and threatens to annihilate her, almost as if she can. As soon as Alexia leaves after throwing her childish tantrum, Beta asks her subordinate to keep tabs on Rose's location. Meanwhile, Kageno reads news about Rose's departure and swoons over how cool it is to run away after stabbing somebody, especially Idor Ashat Fiance. When it's his turn to fight, he leaves the stadium but comes across a hooded bombshell who stops him and asks why he smells of elves. Kageno honestly says he does have elf friends, making her ask if any of them look like her. As she removes her hood, Kageno realizes she's the spitting image of Alpha, but lies that she doesn't resemble anyone he knows. To test if he's an evil lord in disguise or just a plain loser, the diva swings her sword at him, only for him to dodge it as typically as a bona fide wimp would. As this lame move puts her worries to bed, she helps him up and tells him, "I'll become super strong someday." Meanwhile, the jock from before and the spoiled, cocky bitch try to figure out the secret behind Kageno's hidden strength, but the jock says it's purely coincidental, while Anaros believes he knows what he's doing. As the match between Goldie and Kageno begins, Anaros reveals that this James Charles Wanade isn't actually unbeaten because he forfeits the matches with opponents he believes he can't beat, despite being fairly strong. On the other hand, Goldie charges at Kageno with his thick and long Excalibur, something he miraculously dodges while cracking his neck. This pisses off the freak, and he delivers an emotional speech about Kageno's lack of expressions, hoping it would provide him with some plot armor. However, even as he unleashes his secret powerful move in the very next moment, Kageno sneezes and knocks him out, winning this round too. On the other hand, Iris meets with Ashat and Rose's father about her disappearance and offers assistance. However, Ashat uses her stance against Alexia's kidnapping as leverage to state that they'd rather deal with the disappearance as a family matter without involving their neighboring kingdoms. While his audacity pisses her off, Iris notices that he isn't as injured or stabbed in the guts as the papers suggested, and that Rose's father isn't in his complete senses for some reason. Meanwhile, Anaros apologizes to Kageno for underestimating her, but claims she's still too strong for him to beat in the final round. Kageno, who has been practicing this since the time he watched Naruto, whispers to her that he's warning her for the last time before taking off the weights on his arms and dropping them like he's the biggest Rock Lee fanatic. This understandably stuns Anaros, but she still believes she'll win, something that Kageno doesn't give two shits about. On the other hand, Rose is being hunted by her own knights while she ventures through the underground sewerage of her city, trying to save herself. The following day, Skell shows up uninvited at Kageno's inn and pesters him to look for Rose, since her kingdom has announced hefty rewards for whoever finds her, with which they can finally keep capitalism from biting them in the back. Although Kageno doesn't want to move an inch, as soon as he catches sight of his sister walking toward his house, he instantly changes his mind and flees with Skell. On his way to find Rose, Kageno comes across a piano sonata he dearly loved in his previous life and suspects that somebody else besides him got resurrected. To find out who it is, he walks into the auditorium playing this piece, only to find that it's Epsilon plagiarizing Beethoven's creation and his ideas once again. Disappointed but not surprised, Kageno recalls being forced to take piano lessons as a kid, when all he wanted to do was run around in the neighborhood with plastic guns and play a street ruffian. This changed when he discovered a tune called Moonlight and began yearning to play this in the background of achieving world dominance one day. Back in the present, after giving Kageno an orgasm with this melody, Epsilon thanks him for showing up, in exchange for which he praises her outfit and how well it fits her curves. Leaving her flustered, he walks out of her room and decides to steal the piano put out on display at the Music Academy. Meanwhile, as Alexia and Beta try to look for Rose, she seeks refuge in the stinky sewers after being completely cooked from all the consecutive fights with the knights and running away. Additionally, as the wound on her chest begins to grow, she realizes she's about to be possessed. In her final moments, she recalls her last meeting with her fiance, during which she realized that her father was high on some green leaves and under the Ashat's control, which forced her to pull her sword at him. Although the blade barely cut him, her own men instantly turned against her, and she had no choice but to flee. Just as she drowns in her misery even further, a beautiful melody catches her attention, and she realizes it's Beethoven's Moonlight, her favorite sonata. Upon discovering who's playing it, she finds Kageno finally fulfilling his dream of playing his edgy alter ego with this dark music in the background. Like some dumb bitch, she begins to clap for him, only for Kageno to question why she's here. This inspires her to yap about her sob story and how she wanted to protect everyone but couldn't. After hearing this, Kageno grants her a piece of his magic and tells her to continue to fight, right before he vanishes in style. As the wound on her chest instantly heals, some masked vigilantes surround her, only for Rose to defeat them all in one swift move, now that she has Kageno's strength. Feeling this immense blow, Alexia and Beta locate her only for Rose to ask that they leave her alone. As Beta realizes this bitch has inherited Kageno's contagious edginess along with his strength too, Alexia reminds her of the promise they made to support each other. However, Rose is too cool to talk to her now, so they instead engage in a fight, only for her to kick Alexia's ass. After leaving her with Beta, Rose finally leaves the gutter to officially become a rogue vigilant. On the other hand, Kageno returns to his dorm only to find Claire waiting for him at the door, and she doesn't seem too happy about him making her wait. Soon enough, she drags him back home and sits on top of him, choking him for making her wait for so long, making him wonder what kind of kink this is. She further elaborates and whines about Kageno not accompanying her to the countryside during their summer break, and gives him a VIP ticket to the Bushin Festival, telling him to attend it if he wants to make up for his broken promise. As he barely survives his sister's antics, Alexia discovers that Beta has left the city too. The following day, the semifinals of the Bushin Festival begin, and Kageno heads to the VIP section, only to find Iris occupying the spot next to him. She doesn't instantly recognize him, but when he mentions Claire, she realizes he's the same kid they groundlessly tortured when that good-for-nothing Alexia was captured. Realizing her mistake, she apologizes to him for the misconduct of her nights, making Kageno bite his lips out of fear that this special treatment might ruin how hard he has worked to stay on the sidelines. She further wishes he would stay friends with her sister as he was, but Kageno explains he was merely sucking up to her for money. Right then, the others ask Iris who she is rooting for in this match, and she mentions Anna Rose. This makes Kageno curious about what they feel about his character, so he asks what they think about him, only to learn they think he's just a weak ass who acts cool because he's got some speed. This makes him realize he could have won the Academy Award if he tried to in his previous life, and he excuses himself to join his next match. On his way to the changing room, Kageno comes across the elf from before who he now knows is the queen of fencing, Beatrix. This startles him a little, but she merely asks him about Alpha again and exchanges her hamburger with the one he bought before. On the other hand, Ashat shows up to spoil the mood and asks her who she thinks will win the next round, Anna Rose or Kageno. Although Iris acknowledges Anna Rose's strength, she mentions the confidence she feels in Kageno's eyes and believes there's a slim chance he might give her a run for her money. True to her word, as the battle begins, Anna Rose's arrogance once again judges him from her high horse and believes she'll win just as long as she outdoes his speed. However, even with repeated attacks, she fails to break his defenses. When it's Kageno's turn to wipe the floor with her sorry ass, he appears on her blind spot and slices through her shoulder, breaking her armor and finishing her in one swift move. Ashat, on the other hand, pisses his pants after witnessing Kageno's immense power and wants to either recruit him to the demon's cult or wipe him out. After some time, the loser bitch approaches Kageno and apologizes for underestimating him, and admits she has been an arrogant prick. Kageno also acknowledges her strength and shakes hands with her before leaving quietly. Meanwhile, after winning her next match fair and square, Iris spots Beatrix and invites her to become her guest during the next match. The elven queen of hotness, on the other hand, offers her a hamburger in return. On the day of the finals, Kageno enjoys some princess treatment in the VIP section when Iris shows up to annoy him. She asks how he's drinking coffee so easily when she can't do so because it's bitter. To get this conversation over with, he suggests she add lots of milk and sugar to her coffee. After doing so, she does enjoy the drink but ends up violating half of the world's rules. Just as they enjoy their coffee in silence and Kageno feels like a celebrity, Beatrix shows up, but the guards refuse to allow her inside with her weapon. Iris immediately intervenes, and after she exposes her identity, everyone who was previously acting tough kneels before her and begins bootlicking to get on her good side. However, her undivided attention is on Kageno, the chick magnet, whom she believes will become stronger in the future, despite everyone else's doubts. Meanwhile, Ashat drugs Rose's father, the Kane, before bringing him to the ceremony to make sure he listens to all of his commands. This shithead's real goal, however, is to assassinate Iris's father, the king of their neighboring kingdom, to start a war between the two and allow the demon cult to flourish in the meantime and attack when both the kingdoms are at their weakest. However, given just how strong Kageno's measly new identity is, he's currently shitting his pants, wondering what he might do if a war were to break as he plans. As soon as he reaches the ceremony with the king, Beatrix smells the drug on the king and mentions how much he stinks, triggering Ashat's sensitive ass. However, just as he begins thrashing her, Iris intervenes and warns him about who he's messing with. Upon learning that he's up against a legendary warrior, the scaredy cat leaves with his tail between his legs. However, now he has one more problem to deal with if he wants to please the demon he's currently serving. Soon enough, the final match between Iris and Kageno begins, and upon shedding her first glance, she realizes just how strong he truly is. She also realizes that no one has seen the full extent of his power yet and plans to finish him before that gets unveiled. With this plan in place, she pulls her sword and aims to finish him in one swift move. However, just as she moves, she envisions Kageno slashing her throat in two and becomes completely paralyzed. Confused and wondering whether there's a bug in the matrix, she tries again, only to imagine her leg flying off this time. Almost as if he's awakened his Sharingan, Kageno continues to show her visions of her death while Rose breaks into the VIP section, only to discover that all the cult members have been wiped out. It turns out that it was the work of Shadow Garden that implores her to move forward with her mission. Back in the match ground, as Iris continues to fall back without attacking, the audience begins to trash-talk her, forcing her to charge forward. However, even this time, a vision stops her in her tracks and Kageno uses this opening to plummet her into the ground. As she gets whooped in front of the whole kingdom, her disappointed father leaves the arena while Ashat panics over just how strong Kageno is, but before he can do anything about that, the bigger problem, Aka Rose, shows up and apologizes to her father for all the wrong she has done yet. The old guy, who is supposed to be possessed, responds to his daughter's apology and forgives her, pissing Ashat off. Right then, Rose draws her sword and charges at him, but he uses a sick old man to shield himself, whom Rose stabs in the process. Remorseless, she decides to slice her neck in half later, revealing that it has been her plan all along to end the royal bloodline so Ashat can't abuse them to wage wars anymore. However, before she can do that, Kageno steps in and reveals his identity as Shadow, whom Rose finally recognizes as the bandit from her past who saved her life. After she confesses to being his biggest fangirl, Rose leaves the stadium and Kageno points his sword at her defiance, only for Beatrix to step in and take him head-on. As war breaks out, Iris's father decides to implement martial law and asks his men to follow the runaway Ashat. On the other hand, while Kageno and Beatrix clash their swords, the truth about his real identity pisses Iris off for the sake of drama, and she swears to finish him with her own strength. On the other hand, Beatrix struggles to keep up with Kageno's supersonic speed and bites the dust every time she tries to land a hit. Right then, Iris shows up with a cheat code up her sleeve in the shape of an artifact, only for Kageno to mock her for being weak and using underhanded means. This blows her fuse, and she fires off her first attack, which Kageno dodges as if it's child's play, all the while evading Beatrix's attacks. Meanwhile, Rose comes across Alpha, who offers her two choices. One, that she joins them, proves herself worthy, and saves her kingdom, and two, goes off on a solo ride that is bound for doom. The princess thinks hard for a moment, but eventually chooses the first one, officially becoming a part of the Shadow Garden. Meanwhile, the girls take Kageno to the streets, since that's where he belongs, but even after they launch attacks after attacks, Kageno survives them all. Eventually, he gets his hands on a pair of crowbars, his favorite weapon, and clashes with them on a moving train, easily holding the upper hand. While Beatrix stays calm and collected, Iris's psycho ass continues to hurt Kageno's ears, so he finally shuts her up with a kick to her ugly face. With her gone, Beatrix uses a powerful clash to slice through Kageno's crowbars, only for him to get his hands on his real weapon, the slime sword. With this, he feels invincible and tells Beatrix that her magic energy is lacking a lot in his comparison, which is why she won't win. Right then, the animalistic madwoman jumps at Kageno with yet another fireball, only for him to survive it almost as if he's heat-resistant. This pisses her off even more, and she makes a two-step plan with Beatrix to take him down, only to be kicked in the chin and walked all over. However, even after tasting the most disgusting form of defeat, Iris still pretends she has the higher hand and threatens him with the fact that all the forces in the kingdom have been deployed after him and that he has nowhere left to run. Her shameless audacity makes Kageno laugh out loud as he wonders why he should be the one running away and from what. considering even the princess is nothing but a measly weak rat. With this, he gives them a taste of his atomic power and spreads his magic throughout the city. Threatening its entire existence, however, he spares them in the end and vanishes. Suffering from such disrespect makes Iris lose her mind, and she whimpers on her knees while Beatrix watches her calmly. A few days later, the news about this incident gets printed in the papers and Cagano gets labeled as the demon of the century. Meanwhile, Ashak gets reprimanded by the higher-ups of the demon cult for letting Rose go, but he promises to capture her as soon as he catches sight of her. On the other hand, Rose gets welcomed to the training grounds of the Shadow Garden, where the first step to learning is how to do fan service the right way. After she's stripped of her name, status, and even her clothes, she is also forced to let go of all her memories, including that of Cagano, which doesn't do her too well emotionally. Meanwhile, Cagano plays his favorite sonata in secret, content that he has finally fulfilled all his goals. Weeks after Rose joined Shadow Garden, the Seven Shadows and a few members of the group gathered before Cagano. They gave him a brief rundown of what had happened since the Bushin Festival and said the cult had halted all their activities in the kingdom. However, there had been a recent increase in the flow of funds going into the lawless city. The city was located in a region that didn't belong to any kingdom and was known as a haven for criminals. In his usual fashion, Cagano began spitting facts that made no sense, and as he spoke, they noticed the moon was red, and the girls began speculating that it was a bad omen. This was because 1,000 years ago, a tragedy occurred in the lawless city when the moon became red. Alpha proposed that the Seven Shadows go to the city, but Cagano told her that he would handle the matter himself. The girls had no idea that the stupid idiot was only going to the city because he believed it was the only place he could make money. Days later, Cagano arrived at the lawless city with Claire, and as she dragged him about, he couldn't help but feel like he'd hit the jackpot. Claire warned him not to do anything that would attract the attention of the locals, but Cagano wasn't paying attention. When he spotted the tower, he asked why they weren't going towards it, and Claire told him she had to get to a meeting with some dark knights. This made him recall how Claire had come to the city to play freelance vampire slayer, and she had only brought him out of consideration for his future. In other words, if he acted like Robin to her Batman, she would secure a spot for him in the Knight's Order once he graduated. Later on, Cagano stood outside the inn they were staying in while he ate a burger, but people kept bumping into him. Every time someone bumped into him, they would steal his wallet. But Cagano didn't overreact because he always got it back and stole their wallets in return. The rest of his day was spent perfecting his pickpocketing skills, and as he began walking back to the inn, he noticed some guys beating up a ghoul. Cagano was surprised because he'd always believed ghouls were ridiculously strong, but seeing as that one was being kicked around like a soccer ball, he was disappointed. Soon the red moon shone brightly in the sky, which caused the ghoul to suddenly become violent. It instantly Rengoku the guy closest to it, and then turned around to bite the second guy. The third guy didn't stick around to find out what would become of his friend and ran away screaming like a little girl. Cagano remained where he was, waiting to see if the guy that was bitten would turn into a ghoul, and he wasn't disappointed when it happened. Both ghouls then began approaching him, and instead of getting rid of them, he began contemplating whether he should run away or stay and fight. Before he came to a decision, a red-haired girl came to his rescue, and when he asked who she was, she said her name was Mary. Bloody Mary told him that she was a vampire hunter just like Alucard, and asked him to scram like the NPC he was. Before she left, she said something that made Cagano's heart race with excitement, something that only ever happened when he discovered the real use of his right hand. Back at the inn, Claire returned to find Cagano's room empty, and it pissed her off that he'd ignored her instructions to wait there for her. Suddenly, the door to the room next to theirs burst open, and a man ran out screaming like a banshee as a female ghoul chased after him. Claire saved his fat ass by kicking the ghoul's head off, and then asked if he'd seen a boy with black hair and black eyes. The man told her no, so she left and went searching for her idiot brother, leaving the shocked man alone with the headless body. A little while later, she found a decapitated body that resembled Cagano, so she hugged the severed head to herself as she begged him to forgive her for bringing him to the city. She was in that position until Mary found her and told her that the head she was hugging didn't belong to Cagano. She said she'd seen someone matching Cagano's description being taken to the Crimson Tower by the followers of the Blood Queen. According to her, the vampires were going to offer him as a sacrifice to the Blood Queen to wake her from her 1,000-year slumber. Claire was surprised to learn that the Blood Queen had been asleep for 1,000 years, and Mary explained that her followers had kept it a secret because they were waiting for the day the moon turned red to wake her. While they were discussing, some ghouls began approaching them, so they made a pact to work together until they reached the Crimson Tower. Outside the Crimson Tower, Yukime, the head of the White Tower, and Juggernaut, the head of the Black Tower, fought some ghouls. When Juggernaut noticed Yukime, he tried to attack her since they were sworn enemies, but before he could reach her, Kageno landed between them. Bear in mind that he didn't do it because he was trying to play the hero or anything like that. He had done it because he felt it was a cool way to make an entrance, and he completed his dramatic entrance by introducing himself as Batman. Sorry, Shadow. Yukime and Juggernaut recognized his name, and since the story going around was that Shadow and his organization were criminals, they didn't try to fight him. Juggernaut then broke down the gates of the Crimson Tower and walked inside after telling Yukime not to get in his way. As expected, Yukime ignored his words and followed him while Kageno went in after her, but before he could go far, the white-haired man who had been chained to the gate tried to attack him. Kageno's spidey senses instantly alerted him, causing him to attack by slicing the man in half using his slime knife. Meanwhile, Beta was inside the Crimson Tower library doing some research on the possessed when Mary and Claire stumbled in through a trapdoor. When they realized they weren't alone, Claire grabbed the hilt of her sword, but Beta assured her that she had no interest in fighting her. Mary also suggested that they avoid picking a fight with Beta and pointed out that she wasn't alone. Claire listened to her and then asked Beta what she was doing there, so Beta explained that she was doing some research on the possessed. She also said she needed a blood sample from the Blood Queen to test the theory that vampire descendants and the possessed were similar. Mary got angry after hearing what Beta said, but Beta told her that her opinions on the subject didn't matter. Claire then asked if there was a way to cure the possessed, and instead of saying yes or no, Beta told her that she had nothing to worry about, which further confused her. Nevertheless, she pushed aside all her questions and reminded Mary that they had come to the tower to save Kageno. When Rose, who was also in the library, heard this, she attempted to go with Claire, but Beta ordered her to stand down. After leaving the library, Claire and Mary ran into Juggernaut and he attacked them. He punched Claire so hard in the face that her body broke through the floor, and when Mary tried to check on her, he used his sword to slice her. Claire managed to climb back up and stabbed him in the foot, but Juggernaut acted like she just used a toothpick to poke his shoe. However, he commended her for getting back up after taking a hit from him and tried to do it again. However, Claire quickly jumped back, and that was when she realized that Mary was badly hurt. She attempted to heal her, but Mary weakly told her that what she needed was her blood. Before Claire could comprehend what she said, Mary kissed her and licked the blood off her lips. Shocked, Claire pulled back, saying she didn't swing that way, but she kept her mouth shut when Mary began to glow red. Once she was healed, Mary attacked Juggernaut using the blood droplets that were floating around her. Juggernaut defended himself against the attack and moved so quickly that the girls didn't see him until he tried to hit Claire. The next moment, Kageno arrived and kicked the John Cena wannabe out of the tower. The girls thanked him, but he just mumbled some words he thought made him sound cool and left. Mary then to Kageno to tell Claire the secret she'd been hiding for the last 1,000 years. If it wasn't already obvious, she was a vampire, and 1,000 years ago, she served as the Blood Queen's maid. During that time, the vampires ruled the city and they fed on humans whenever they wanted. Eventually, the humans learned how to slay them, and the hunters became the hunted. Elizabeth, the Blood Queen, to Kageno the only way to survive was to give up blood, so her subjects followed in her footsteps. As time went on, the vampires lost their powers, but in return, they gained the ability to walk under the sun. Elizabeth was the only one who didn't receive this gift, but she didn't mind because she had taught her people to coexist with humans. Unfortunately, on the night the red moon rose in the sky, Lord Crimson found Elizabeth trying to keep her bloodlust at bay, so he gave her a single drop of blood to quench her thirst. This made her crave more blood, and she spent 3 days and 3 nights feasting on the townspeople. When she finally came to her senses, she asked Mary to scatter her ashes in the sea and plunged a dagger into her chest. Since she wasn't an ordinary vampire, she never turned to ash, so Mary put her in a stone coffin, promising to watch over her. Immediately after that, Crimson and his cohorts cut off her head and told her they would spare her life because she was loyal to their queen. Before they let her go, Crimson told her that she should never return unless she changed her mind and was ready to join their cause. When she finished her tale, Claire told her she couldn't judge as she also had a secret. She said she showed signs of possession as a child and was sure she would transform into a monster anytime soon. The reason she brought Kageno with her to the lawless city was because she wanted to do something for him before she died. Mary consoled her and said she could still redeem herself by saving Kad from Crimson. Meanwhile, Kageno found the tower's treasure room and helped himself to all the gold coins he could find. On the rooftop, Crimson took Elizabeth's heart and pushed it inside the body of the young man they had kidnapped. Just as the body began to react to the new heart, Kageno showed up and set off an explosion. The impact of the explosion cut Crimson in two and beheaded Elizabeth's new body, and since Kageno didn't sense anyone else on the roof, he left to find some gold coins in the fortress. Just then, Mary and Claire arrived and began searching for him, but the dust made it hard for them to see. Suddenly, Mary screamed at Claire to be careful, but it was too late and she got stabbed in the heart by a blood tentacle. The tentacle belonged to Elizabeth and immediately pulled Claire closer to suck on her like the night's appetizer. Mary tried to stop her, but it seemed like she was still asleep, so she didn't hear her. Just then, Kageno's fan club arrived and beheaded Elizabeth while snatching Claire's body at the same time. They attempted to get rid of her completely by causing her to explode, but that didn't work. One of the girls used healing magic on Claire to fix her wounds, but she told Beta that they needed to get her to a hospital. Beta said they couldn't leave until they had dealt with the Blood Queen, so she and the others attacked Elizabeth again. Unfortunately, nothing they did worked, and they kept getting their asses handed to them. Yukime watched the fight from afar, as she was wise enough to know that if she engaged Elizabeth, she would watch the rest of the fight from heaven. Juggernaut, on the other hand, thought it was the staged Monday Night Raw, so he stupidly punched Elizabeth in the face. Elizabeth retaliated by smacking him into the wall closest to where Yukime was, and she mocked him for being stupid. Elizabeth then hit them with a rain of blood, which was just as sharp as a knife because it injured them. The Shadow Garden girls had used their bodies to protect Claire, so their injuries were more than hers. Beta then observed Elizabeth and discovered that she was stealing their blood and healing herself with it. The next moment, the bodies of the Shadow Garden girls began reverting to rotting flesh, making them remember the days they were still possessed. Claire's body was affected too, but since she was unconscious, she couldn't freak out about it like the others. However, in her head, she woke up in a school infirmary, and that made her confused as she had no idea what the place was. Aurora was the nurse, and she told Claire that her body was fighting against the curse. She revealed that Claire's possession had been cured a long time ago, but refused to say who cured her. She also said that she had 2 types of blood in her body and that they were trying to adapt. Her statement didn't do anything to ease Claire's mind, and it only became worse when a mark appeared on her left arm. Aurora said the mark would help Claire control her powers, so Claire asked why she was helping her, and Aurora told her it was because she belonged to Shadow. Back in the real world, Claire woke up, but Beta noticed that the person in control of the body was Aurora. When she asked why she was in Claire's body, the witch gave her a vague answer and turned her attention to Elizabeth. Both women began fighting, using blood, and when Aurora had had enough, she attempted to finish Elizabeth off with Kageno's atomic spell. Before she could activate the spell, her arm broke, and she realized that Claire's body couldn't handle the strain of that level of magic. Beta became worried, but Aurora assured her that Claire would be fine and said she didn't have to do anything again as Kageno had arrived. Suddenly, Kageno jumped down and began fighting Elizabeth while trying to save his precious gold. Beta heard him saying he couldn't afford to lose anyone, and she immediately assumed he was talking about them, not realizing that he was referring to his money. She began cheering him on, but had no idea he didn't hear a single word of what she said because he was focused on the task at hand. Eventually, he and Elizabeth took to the skies, fighting each other with their blood and slime spears until Kageno closed in on her. Mary screamed, thinking he was going to finish Elizabeth off, but he simply activated a recovery spell. Immediately, a ripple of magical energy swept across the city, and all the ghouls reverted to being humans. Beta and the others were healed, and after confirming that Claire was still alive, she ordered her team to retreat. The moon also changed colors, so Elizabeth's blood rage was stopped, and Mary sat beside her as she slept. The next day, Claire said goodbye to Mary at the train station and left the city with Kageno. During the train ride, Claire told Kageno that a special power had taken root in her left arm, and she had to solve the mystery behind the powers she received. Seeing how scared and confused she looked, Kageno assured her that no matter what path she took, he'd also be by her side. Some nights later, a train transporting Mitsugoshi's goods was attacked by bandits, who claimed they had been sent by a man named Garter. According to the frog-eyed fool who used a knife to cut open the dress of one of the Mitsugoshi employees, Garter was pissed that Mitsugoshi was making more money than him. One of the employees argued that Garter would never stoop to using such deplorable tactics, but the bandit told her Garter was a wolf in sheep's clothing. After he said this, she shocked him by telling him that she was already aware of it. The next moment, Alpha spoke up from behind the bandits, thanking them for confirming their suspicions. That was when the bandits realized they had fallen into Shadow Garden's trap, and before they could retreat, Alpha gave the order for them to be disposed of. Days later, Kageno went out with his friends, and while he ate, the two idiots showed off their new outfits from Mitsugoshi. Since the only thing their imbecile brains could think about was how to get laid, they told Kageno that girls would flock to them once they saw them in those clothes. While they were making kissy faces, Kageno noticed the logo on Skell's shirt was pedaling off, so he pointed it out. Skell screamed when he saw it, and Po foolishly asked if they had bought cheap knockoffs. Kageno just watched them without saying a word, but after a while he examined his outfit. Everything he had on had been chosen by the girls, and he couldn't help but feel they were rip-offs of the clothes from his past life. Looking out the window, he noticed that most of the people moving around were dressed in suits. This was also the girls' doing, and he felt they were stealing business from their competitors, because everyone preferred to shop at their stores. However, he told himself all of that would end, and then got up from his chair. His friends asked where he was going, and he told them that he was going to retrieve what belonged to him. That night he got dressed in an all-black suit and completed his look with a mask. Feeling like James Bond, the fool declared that the world would know his name, and he would be remembered as a super elite agent. Later on, he met Yukime on a train, and when she addressed him as Shadow, he told her he'd forsaken that name and said he wanted to be known as John Smith from that moment on. The reason for their meeting was to discuss the downfall of Mitsugoshi and the major corporate alliance. Their plan was simple. While both parties worked to destroy each other, she and John Smith would work together behind the scenes to take all their money. Yukime warned Kageno that things would get messy because of Getten, the real head of the alliance. It seemed she had a score from the past to settle with him, and she told Kageno that when their business was over, she would take Getten's head. Just then the train pulled into the station, so before leaving, Kageno promised Yukime that he would destroy everything and rebuild when the time was right. The next day, the stores owned by the members of the major corporate alliance held sales across all the shopping districts. Kageno deduced that it was because they felt threatened by Mitsugoshi, since they had begun selling exclusive products that could only be found at their stores. He knew it was only a matter of time before the alliance would crush Mitsugoshi, and he would retaliate. By using the money, he would profit from the downfall of both groups. He would move to a brand new market and start a new business. He would then appoint Alpha and the others as part of the upper management. He knew the girls would be mad at him for destroying their business, but he was sure they would forgive him once he explained everything. After the sales ended for the day, Kageno and Skell waited for Po to pay for his items so they could leave. The bill he was given after paying looked different, so Kageno asked if the design had recently been changed. Po explained that the bill was a new bill put out by the major corporate alliance. The old bills had been issued by the Mitsugoshi Bank and had a completely different design. Kageno couldn't believe that the girls had a bank of their own, but then he remembered he'd once told them about banks and credit creation. As he stared at the money in his hands, he suddenly got an idea and ran off with the money. That night, he met Yukime again and gave her a brief lecture on money, credits, and loans. After his lecture, he proposed that they create counterfeit bills and circulate them throughout the kingdom. Yukime agreed with his plan because, for some reason, she believed that what Kageno wanted was to cause a total credit collapse and not gather money to fund his lifestyle. Elsewhere, some Shadow Garden members dumped the body of a man in the middle of the street. The next day, Garter showed Getten the newspaper with a segment about the body that was found the night before. He confirmed that the man had been one of the mercenaries they had sent to steal from Mitsugoshi. Getten then ordered him to send a group called the Clovers to handle the next mission, since the last group they sent were a bunch of incompetent nitwits. Unfortunately, the Clovers weren't successful as Delta was the person they encountered when they went on the mission. One of the members happened to be her brother, but Delta showed no sign of remorse when she stabbed him. Kageno asked how she could murder her brother in cold blood, and she told him that weaklings like him brought shame to their family. It was normal for the weaker ones in their clan to be hunted, and they had done the same thing to her when she began showing signs of possession. She also told him that her brother wouldn't be missed as their father was the clan leader and he had lots of lovers as well as over 1,000 children. On way home, Delta suggested that Kageno fight her father and said that if he won, he would become their clan leader. Kageno told her he wasn't interested, so she tried to make him change his mind by promising to help him build a harem. Still, he turned her down and told her to be quiet until they got home, which made her sulk. Later that day, Garter informed Getten that the Clovers had been slaughtered, so Getten ordered that he send their top 3 assassins. He said he wanted all of Mitsugoshi's trade secrets and didn't care how they did it. That night, while Gamma gave Alpha a brief report on how the secret war was going, Nu came into the room and informed them that they had unwanted visitors. Alpha instructed Nu to handle the situation, but Gamma insisted she be the one to do it. Alpha knew that Gamma was an unfortunate scatterbrain, so she made Omega and Chi go with her to avoid problems. Down in the department store, the assassins tried to find Gamma's office, but were surprised to see her standing before them. In the blink of an eye, Omega and Chi slammed 2 of the men into the wall, leaving the last one alone with Gamma. The man assumed she would be easy prey, so he attempted to knock her out, but when he hit her, nothing happened. Gamma just screamed in pain and complained that he wasn't trying to fight fair. The next moment, a sword made out of slime materialized in her hand and she began taking swings at the man. He kept dodging her attacks even though she was fast, but he also noticed that Gamma's combat abilities were non-existent. Suddenly, her sword lit up, and as she pointed it at him, she told him that she knew he had mastered the Western Leitenroy style of fencing, which surprised him. Before he could respond, she began swinging her sword again, so he quickly moved out of the way. In an attempt to defend himself, he brought out a hidden knife, but when he hit Gamma's head with it, the knife bent out of shape. Confused, he jumped back, but Gamma got over the pain she felt and used her sword to blast him. The man barely escaped, but she was relentless and kept charging at him until she tripped over a rock and fell. But the idiot dumbass gave her opponent credit for what happened. She claimed he'd set a trap for her, but all the man could think about was how to get away from the psychopath in front of him. He called out to his friends, but it was Chi who answered him as his friends had been beaten up. Realizing he was cornered, the man attempted to flee, but Gamma went after him. Like the last time, she tripped over a rock and fell, so her sword went flying out of her hand and into the back of the man's neck before it exploded. Even though that hadn't been what she intended to do, Gamma told the girls that it was her secret technique. The following day, Getten received the news that his assassins had failed their mission and they had lost contact with the backup team sent to help them. After Garter left, Getten wondered if it was time for him to get involved with the Mitsugoshi matter. He would have loved to send in some of the cult's first or second children, but he knew they wouldn't approve because of the enkejinot that happened at the academy. In the end, he enkejinot the best course of action was to bid his time until his business, with the major corporation alliance, was concluded. He was sure that by that time, he'd have gained more power, and then he'd take revenge on the person who blinded him. Later that night, Kageno, dressed up as John Smith, was informed that the counterfeit bills were ready to be distributed, and that made him smile. Yukime had used the abandoned mine that belonged to Viscount Greece as her base of operations. Once the bills were printed, they would be taken to the lawless city before they were sent to where they'd planned to distribute them. The bills were so similar to the original ones made by the major corporate alliance that Kageno couldn't tell the difference when Yukime showed it to him. Since they were about to begin distributing the bills, Yukum told Kageno that he needed to be vigilant because the authorities would try to find the source of the counterfeit bills. She reminded him that he was free to take down anyone who tried to snoop around, however, Getten was hers to deal with. Days later, Gamma informed Alpha that counterfeit bills were being used in their stores, so Alpha ordered her to look into the matter properly. At the same time, Garter presented Getten with the counterfeit bills, and he also couldn't tell the difference. He ordered Garter to find out where they were coming from, and the little man rushed out to do what he'd been told. Once he was alone, Getten wondered how long it would take the people to learn that most of the bills they had were fake. It turned out he had secretly been circulating counterfeit bills long before Kageno and Yukime came up with their plan. Unlike them, he planned to play the long game and gradually take back all the cult's assets hidden within the major corporate alliances before the credit collapse happened. Now he was worried that if they couldn't find those responsible for the new counterfeit bills, the cult would lose a lot of money. A few days later, Rose's team located the train transporting the counterfeit bills from the lawless city. They snuck into one of the train cars and began looking around for clues, but Rose noticed something was off. Before she could warn the others, they were tied up with threads. When they attempted to cut the threads, their blades shattered to pieces, since the threads were magically reinforced. Rose was the only one not tied up, so she demanded to know who Kageno was, as she couldn't recognize him with his mask on. Kageno introduced himself as John Smith and began attacking her, so she charged at him with her sword drawn. Like a true puppeteer, Kageno controlled his threads, using them as a shield to protect himself from her attack. When she tried to move, he tied her up and told the group that it wasn't time for them to learn more about his plans. After saying this, he tossed them out of the moving train using the threads. Rose tried to chase after the train, but 664 told her not to do so as it was risky to go after him without a plan. She suggested they return to the headquarters and report their encounter to Gamma. Rose agreed, but she couldn't stop thinking about John Smith and how she'd been too weak to fight him. When they arrived at the Shadow Garden headquarters in the capital, the girls told Gamma and Alpha what happened. The name John Smith was a mystery to them, and they wondered if he was a member of the Dark Tower in the Lawless City. Rose told them that John Smith's skill set was way above that of the muscle-headed fools at the Dark Tower. She said he moved like someone with years of experience, and he was far more powerful than the Seven Shadows. 664 tried to shut her up, but Rose kept talking and begged Alpha to send her back to face John Smith, so they dragged her out of the room. Rose's words made Alpha feel uneasy, so she asked Gamma to send Delta to deal with John Smith. The next day, while transporting the counterfeit bills, Kageno spotted Delta running outside, so he waited for her to attack. She burst through the window and tried to claw him to death, but he used his threads to defend himself against her attacks. Even though everyone saw Delta as a stupid mutt without a functioning brain, she was quick to notice Kageno was using the roof of the train car to move his threads, so she destroyed it. Kageno commended her for making such a smart move, but didn't give her the chance to get closer to him by dumping the rubble on her. As Delta struggled to get out from underneath the rubble, Kageno walked close to her. As he rambled on about some things that didn't make sense to her, she got a whiff of his garbage cologne. Once she realized who he was, she freed herself and jumped on his body in excitement. Having no other choice, Kageno allowed her to ride his shoulders as he walked to the next train car. He then asked what she was doing in that area, and she told him that Alpha had sent her to hunt John Smith. When she remembered he was John Smith, she said she was going to report to Alpha that he was the cause of their problems. Kageno told her that if she did that, his secret mission wouldn't be a secret anymore, and he didn't want that, so she asked if she could tag along. Kageno said she couldn't, as the mission was something only he could do. She then asked what she'd tell Alpha when she returned to the capital, and he told her that she didn't have to say anything to Alpha. Delta argued that she had to say something or else Alpha would get angry at her, so he told her that she would go on another hunting mission. Hearing that she could hunt something made her happy, so she asked what her target was. Kageno then instructed her to go to the Lawless City and find Juggernaut. After confirming all the details about where to find Juggernaut, Delta jumped out of the train and headed in the direction of the Lawless City. When Delta failed to report back to Alpha, Gamma sent people to investigate and discovered evidence of the battle. However, Delta was nowhere to be found, and the only thing that proved she was ever there was the bell she always wore on her tail. This made them believe Delta was dead, so Alpha instructed that they keep searching for her body. Gamma then informed Alpha that the number of counterfeit bills in circulation had doubled. She said it wouldn't be long before the people began to doubt the value of all paper money and start demanding the banks return their gold coins. If that happened, their establishment's assets wouldn't be enough to satisfy those demands. Suddenly, magical energy began swirling around Alpha, and she told Gamma that from the start, John Smith had planned to cause a credit collapse. He knew they were engaged in a war with the Alliance, so he used that opportunity to make his move and take all the profits for himself. Meanwhile, two representatives of the cult visited Gettin and informed him that the cult was concerned about the counterfeit bills in circulation. They said that if he didn't get things under control, they would take action, and he wouldn't like what type of action it would be. Gettin got tired of listening to them, so he cut off the head of one of the men and asked the other one if he knew the person responsible for circulating the bills. Afraid for his life, the man told him the man responsible was John Smith, so Gettin ordered Garter to set up checkpoints and inspect everything going in and out of the city. Garter tried to tell him that doing that would draw attention to them, so Gettin cut the second man's head off as a warning. Immediately, Garter left to do what he'd been ordered to do, and before long the checkpoints were set up. One evening, Beta visited Kageno in his room to inform him of Delta's supposed demise. Kageno told her not to worry as Delta had merely gone somewhere far away, but refused to say anything more. Beta assumed he was trying to console her after the loss of her friend, so she wiped her tears. She then asked Kageno if he could handle the John Smith situation, and he told her that he had more important things to deal with. Before leaving, he showed her his notebook where he'd written something using hiragana, kanji, katakana, Roman letters, and Arabic numerals. He claimed he developed them, and told her that if she could decipher what he'd written, he would teach her how to write them. That night, when the train transporting the counterfeit bills was about to get to one of the Alliance checkpoints, Kageno got out of the train and destroyed the barricades that had been set up. As the train kept heading towards its destination, Alpha attacked Kageno. Both of them engaged in a heated battle for a while until Alpha realized that the man she was fighting was her master. She demanded to know what he'd done to Delta, and he told her that he'd sent her somewhere far away. His answer only made her angrier, so she began channeling her magical energy as she asked why he was betraying them. Kageno told her that once everything was over, she would understand why he did the things he did. Suddenly, she attacked him, but Kageno was no match for her, and he easily defended himself with his threads. When she tried to stab him, he caught her sword with his hand and threw her in the air before using his finishing move to send her flying off the train. Later on, he met Yukime at their base of operations, and she showed him all the money they had made. She said the Alliance's coffers were already empty, and they would be unable to meet the demands of the people. On their way back to the city, she thanked him for working with her in the Keijanode to tell him the reason she batted Getten. Years ago, after the great hero Shiba fell, the demi-humans clans began fighting for dominance. In their quest for survival, the Fox clan and the Wolf clan Keijanode to ally with each other. To seal this alliance, she and Getten were chosen to marry one another, and they were a happy couple. However, one day a fight between their clan and another broke out, and her village was razed to the ground. She later discovered that Getten had murdered her mother because he blamed her for what happened. When she tried to make him pay for it, he slashed her and left her for dead. She managed to survive but was forced to become a prostitute in the lawless city. Eventually, she made her way to the top, and since then, she'd been biding her time and plotting her revenge. When they arrived at the train station, she told Kageno that her true objective was to make Getten lose everything he had. Now that she'd done that, she was going to find him and settle their score. The next day, people rushed to the banks to redeem their gold coins, but most of the banks had already closed down. In another part of town, Getten and Garter were in a carriage heading for their establishment when Garter revealed that Yukime was responsible for the counterfeit bills. While trying to come to terms with what he just learned, he suddenly heard the sound of Yukime's bell. Using his remaining senses, he pinpointed her location and ordered the carriage to stop so he could go after her. Meanwhile, at the Shadow Garden headquarters, a depressed Alpha was holed up in her study. Gamma found her sitting in front of the fireplace and broke the news that the major corporate alliance had fallen. She said the people had begun storming their banks trying to redeem their coins. Alpha asked if they had enough money to meet the people's needs, and Gamma said they didn't. She then suggested they come up with a plan to save their establishments, but Alpha told her there was nothing they could do. She revealed that Kageno was the mastermind behind everything, and he'd done nothing to spare them from the aftermath. When she said Kageno had forsaken them, Gamma argued that it wasn't so, but Alpha told her it was the truth. As far as she was concerned, their incompetence was the reason he cut them loose. Upon hearing this, Gamma fell to her knees and began sobbing, but the next moment, Nu walked in. She told them that they had found evidence that Getten had been ordered by the cult to circulate counterfeit bills. When she mentioned that her goal had been to make Mitsugoshi bankrupt, the clogs in Alpha's head began to turn. She pointed out that if Getten had already been circulating counterfeit bills before Kageno started doing it, that meant that Kageno discovered his plans. What she couldn't piece together was why he didn't try to warn or involve them in his plans, but her questions were soon answered by Beta, who rushed into the room. She announced that she had deciphered the note Kageno gave to her, and when Alpha read it, her eyes became teary. In the note, Kageno had written that he had betrayed them for their good. He asked them not to worry, as all the money he made from the counterfeit bills was stored safely in Viscount Grease's old mine. The girls felt relieved after reading the note, and they thanked the gods that Kageno hadn't abandoned them like they believed. Once again, they assumed he'd done everything for their sake, but that was far from the truth. The only reason Kageno did what he did was because he was a selfish asshole who just wanted to keep all the money for himself. The girls were just an afterthought, and only because their brains would help boost the sales of whatever business venture he wished to go into. While they were discussing Cagneo's so-called affection for them, Gamma asked Alpha about Delta. Alpha told them not to worry, and soon after she said that, Delta came into the office from the window, and the girls rushed to hug her. She apologized for making them worry and said she was completing a mission for Cagneo, but refused to tell them what it was. Later that day, when Cagneo returned to the mine after slaughtering a few Alliance assassins who came after him, he found the place empty. As he tried to understand where all his money had gone, Yukime's girls rushed in and told him that they couldn't contact Yukime. They said she had gone to confront Getten and was yet to return, but all Cagneo heard was Getten's name. He immediately assumed Getten had located the hideout and stolen all the money. Enraged, he went Super Saiyan and swore that Getten would pay for what he'd done. Meanwhile, Getten and Yukime were engaged in a heated battle, but at some point Yukime injured him. However, she decaged not to end his life, because she wanted to believe he still had some good in him. When she began walking away, Getten got pissed thinking that she was trying to mock him. The next moment, he popped one of the red pills into his mouth, and after he swallowed it, he became strong. His eyes even opened, and before Yukime could react, he charged at her and struck her down. As she lay on the floor, he told her that he should have made sure she died that day and attempted to finish her off. Suddenly, he was hit with a Saitama-inspired punch that sent him flying into a tree, and when he looked up he saw that Cagneo was the culprit. Getten got up and told Cagneo he was a fool for coming to challenge him, but Cagneo wasn't scared of him. He charged at him again, and as they fought, he told Getten he had come to retrieve some precious to him. This statement made Getten think Cagneo was referring to Yukime, and since he was still in love with her, he got mad. Unfortunately, neither his rage nor the pills were enough to help him win against Cagneo. In the end, all he could do was mumble weakly as Cagneo kept asking him to talk while he rearranged his face with his fist. Before he died, Getten told Cagneo that he was leaving him his most precious thing. The way he said it made Cagneo think he had buried all the money where Yukime was standing, but in reality, he was telling Cagneo he wanted him to take care of Yukime. Cagneo then approached Yukime, and as he healed her wound, she realized he was the one who saved her on the day Getten had left her for dead. She began crying and thanked him for everything he'd done for her. Back in the city, Eris destroyed the door of the Alliance Bank's vault, and once she saw that it was empty, she ordered that Garter be arrested for embezzlement. Later on, Yukime returned to the hideout, and her girls informed her that all the money was gone. When she went down to look at the place, they found Alpha waiting for them. She told Yukime that Getten had done the things he did because he was tricked by the cult of Diabolos into believing they would give him power if he worked with them. She said their organization was fighting to stop the cult and Shadow was their leader. She also revealed that Mitsugoshi was a front for Shadow Garden and everything Cagneo did was for them. She let her know that they were the ones who took all the money and asked Yukime if she would like to work with them. Yukime agreed, and the two women shook hands to show they were on the same page. Meanwhile, Cagneo was busy digging the place Getten pointed at before he died, hoping he would find the money there. Delta was with him, and she kept digging even though she didn't know what he was searching for. After digging for hours with no success, he gave up and told Cagneo to leave, but he didn't head back to the city. This was because he believed the girls were angry with him for betraying them, and he hoped that giving them space would make them forgive him. A few days later, Skell and Poe went to Cagneo's room hoping to get him to join them on a day out in town to pick up girls. However, they were surprised to find the room empty, and instead of leaving like normal people would, they ventured into the room. As they looked around the room, they noticed some VIP tickets for the grand opening of the Mitsugoshi Hot Springs. The tickets were only given to high-class members of the society, so Skell thought it would be a great idea to take them. He explained that if they showed the tickets to some girls, it would boost their chances of getting dates. Later that day, they went to Mitsugoshi and asked Nu if she wanted to go with them to the hot springs. When Nu noticed the tickets they had with them, she took them to a private room where she asked how they came into possession of the tickets. Mind you, she didn't ask them nicely and behaved like a proper Yakuza boss. To make matters worse, behind her were two girls polishing weapons, causing the two spineless wimps to cower in fear. After stuttering like fools, they blurted out that the tickets were gifts from Cagneo, claiming that he'd told them to use the tickets to ask the ladies of Mitsugoshi out on a date. Nu was shocked to hear this but assumed Kageno had summoned them under the pretext of a date. She then ordered the boys to wait for her and went to inform the Seven Shadows of the development. Nu told them about her theory, and believe it or not, the girls agreed with her. They were convinced Kageno wanted them at the hot springs for something relating to the legend of the dragon tears. Years ago, they encountered an enemy who told them they would never find the dragon's tears. After he died, Kageno had asked them to dig up the area to find the dragon's tears. The girls dug until Ida discovered the hot spring, and that was why they chose to build their hot spring resort there. However, since they had found no clues relating to a dragon, Epsilon asked if the reason Kageno wanted them at the resort was because the cult was planning something. Since they weren't sure what the reasons were, they agreed that 3 of them would join the boys for their date. Each girl insisted they be the one to go, so Alpha proposed they settled things the only way they knew how, through a game of rock, paper, scissors. On the day of the grand opening, Beta, Zeta, and Delta met Skell and Poe outside the resort since they were the chosen ones. Noticing Kageno's absence, Delta asked where he was, and the boys told her he was running late. Of course, that was a lie because they had no idea where Kageno was, but the girls didn't know that. When the girls went to get changed, Poe pulled out a book written by someone called Count Virgin Boy. The man was supposedly a Riz Lord and had written a book to help losers like them bag girls way out of their league. Poe swore that with that book in their possession, they would finally get laid and stop attending Virgin's therapy every weekend. Inside the changing room, the girls told Alpha what Poe and Skell said about Kageno. In her infinite wisdom, Alpha pointed out that there was a possibility that Kageno wouldn't show up, so they might have to complete the mission, whatever it may be, by themselves. However, she advised them to be on their toes as anything could happen, and after saying that, she struck a pose. The others looked at her like she'd lost a few screws, but they dared not say anything to her face. Later on at the pool, Delta and Zeta engaged Poe and Skell in a game of volleyball. But somehow it turned into a game of strength between the 2 girls. Unfortunately, poor Skell bore the brunt of the game and was sent flying into the pool with a bloody nose. While the girls continued challenging themselves with different other games, Alpha and Gamma watched on. Gamma complained that they were slacking off and said it could lead to the mission failing, but Alpha disagreed with her. She said that for the first time in a long while, the girls looked happy and relaxed. Going further, she said that Kageno might have intended for them to have a date off and not handle a mission like they assumed. Just then, Ida popped up out of nowhere and said she had picked up an abnormal magical energy coming from underground. Elsewhere, Skell and Poe were floating around the pool talking about the girls. The dumb idiots had deluded themselves into believing that the girls were secretly into them and to Kageno to push their luck. Since they knew the girls had gone to the baths, Poe suggested that they find a way to see what the girls were doing there. In other words, they were going to act like a bunch of shameless degenerates by becoming peeping toms. In the girls' bath, Beta complained that they had lost sight of the mission, even though they had no idea what it was in the first place. This made Zeta say they needed to rethink what Kageno's true objectives were. Unlike the others who were dead sure the so-called mission had something to do with the cult, Zeta believed it had to do with the dragon's tears. She then did Kageno to tell her companions the story so they could understand what she was talking about. According to her, many years ago, a princess rescued a small dragon that had been separated from its family. As time passed, the bond between the princess and the dragon grew, and they became like 2 peas in a pod. Unfortunately, their peaceful and happy lives ended when a war broke out and the dragon left to help the soldiers fight. When the dragon returned home, it discovered that the capital had been attacked and the princess was on the verge of death. The dragon begged the princess not to leave it, but it was too late, and before she passed on, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Upon seeing this, the dragon began weeping uncontrollably until its tears flooded the entire kingdom. Sometime later, the princess awoke to find a mysterious spring of warm water, but the dragon was nowhere to be found. She called out to it, hoping the winds would carry her voice to it, but it never answered her calls. After her story, Zeta said it was possible that what Kageno wanted them to uncover was somewhere in the tale. This made Beta ask if what they needed to focus on was the water in the spring, and Zeta told her that their research showed that it was a normal hot spring. Meanwhile, Poe and Skell were trying to get a good look at the girls from over the wall separating the male and female baths. Unfortunately for them, there was a security system installed on the side of the wall which Edith activated. Immediately, they were hit with a purple gas that got into their eyes and made them cry like babies. Some of their tears dropped into the water, causing it to react and produce a bright light as the entire area shook. The girls then took Kageno to see what would happen if more tears were dropped into the water. They tied Delta up and said a lot of hurtful things that made her cry so much that when her tears hit the water it reacted immediately. The water began glowing and the magical energy shook the entire place like there was an earthquake. When they all ran outside, they discovered that the water in the pool had taken the form of a dragon and was twisting about. Gamma ordered that the guests be taken to safety while she and the rest of the 7 shadows handled the problem. After a quick outfit change, the girls charged at the water dragon, but Gamma the Klutz tripped over something and fell. While she was being taken care of, the others fought the dragon until Alpha hit it with a powerful magical strike, resulting in golden specks falling from the sky. It turned out that the legend of the dragon's tears were real, and when Alpha delivered the final blow, she freed the spirit of the dragon that had been trapped there for years. Before leaving, the spirit of the dragon consoled Beta, who was still weeping because of what the others said to her. A quick analysis by Ida confirmed that the spring had been imbued with many magical properties. Alpha then concluded that the mission Kageno had given to them was to set the dragon free. With everything said and done, they allowed the guests to return and began selling limited edition items to them. As Alpha observed everything going on, she thanked Kageno for allowing them to enjoy themselves for the first time in a long while. Speaking of Kageno, he was in the kingdom of Oriana and was staying at an inn. That morning, as he held the morning paper in his hands, he thought about his life like he'd been doing since left the kingdom of Midgar, to give Alpha and the others time to forgive him for his betrayal. He realized that even though he'd been working hard to become the eminence in Shadow, he never really had a clear image of what that would be like. He had a feeling he was missing out on an important aspect, but he wasn't sure what that was. Upstairs, Rose was fast asleep, but she was dreaming of the day she stabbed her father to death. Just as her father swore never to forgive her for what she'd done, she woke up from her accursed dream. When she looked out the window, she saw the crumbling remains of a once bubbling and happy town. It saddened her as she joined Shadow Garden, hoping to get stronger and protect her people, but that hadn't been the case. The next moment, someone knocked on her door, asking her to get ready as they were leaving. Using her slime powers, she got dressed quickly and joined 664 and 665 as they made their way through town. 664 said that their mission would be led by 559, one of the most skilled Shadow Guard members. That night they met 559, whose real name was Victoria, on the city's outskirts, and she briefed them about their mission. Their main objective was to discover why the cult had deployed its most elite force to the small town. As they walked along the walls of the city, Victoria asked Rose if she knew why she'd been chosen to join them on their mission. Rose said it was because she was familiar with the area, but Victoria told her that wasn't the only reason. She revealed that she'd requested Rose be put on her team because she wanted to keep an eye on her. Victoria explained that aside from the 7 shadows, she and Rose were the only other people who'd received their powers from Shadow. However, unlike the rest of them, Rose was weak, making her unworthy of the powers Shadow had bestowed on her. Just as she told Rose she wouldn't hesitate to get rid of her if she stepped out of line, they heard the sound of carriages. After observing the path the carriages took, Victoria asked Rose where the path led. Rose told her it led to some ruins that used to be a memorial ground for the warriors who fought the demon Diablos. At the ruins, the girls saw one of the cult's top leaders, and 664 pointed out that his entire entourage were first children. As they watched, they saw one of the soldiers pull out a card Rose recognized was very similar to the one Nelson used in the sanctuary. Once the card was inserted into the stone, a bright light enveloped the place and Rose's mother came forward. The cult leader asked her to place her hand on the glyph above the stone, and she did. The next moment, the stone opened up to reveal a ring, which they took. Just then, Victoria ordered her team to prepare for combat, and their priority was to retrieve the ring as it was a key. The others had no idea what Victoria meant by the ring being a key, but they reminded her that their mission was strictly reconnaissance. Rose even pointed out that her mother would be caught up in the fight, but Victoria didn't care. After she leaped down from their hiding spot, the queen was the first person she tried to attack. Thankfully, Rose acted quickly and blocked her blade before it could touch her mother. When the queen realized the person defending her was her daughter, she clung to her and begged her to save her. Taking advantage of Rose's momentary distraction, Victoria punched her in the face, pushing her back. This made the cult members pull out their swords and take a defensive stance, so Victoria declared Rose to be a traitor. The next day, Gamma was updated about Rose and Victoria's mission. She was told that the team engaged the cult members and Rose had supposedly betrayed them to save her mother. Gamma wasn't surprised and said they were to blame for not telling Rose the truth about her mother before sending her on the mission. However, there was nothing they could do now that she'd returned to her place as the Princess of Oriana and was set to marry Perv-Ashat once again. Meanwhile, Kageno was reading the morning paper as he waited for his breakfast to be served and devised a plan. This was his simple plan as far as all plans went, and all he needed to make it work was Rose. He figured he could work behind the scenes and convince Rose to take the throne so she could become the tyrant queen. Once that had happened, he would swoop in like Superman and save the king from her. Even though his plan seemed cruel, Kageno didn't care as it was just another way to show his superiority as the eminence in shadow. Suddenly, the door to the inn was kicked open and 3 soldiers walked in, demanding that Marie pay tribute to them. Marie pointed out that she'd already given tribute the day before, but they refused to listen. As they began rummaging through her things, Marie tried to stop them, but one of them grabbed her by the collar and threatened her. He even went as far as telling her that she could pay her tribute in kind simply because he was a cultured pig. Just then, Kageno decagenoed to play the hero and screamed at the brute to let Marie be. The funny thing was that he acted like he was scared and shook so much you'd think his knees were made of jelly. In response to his somewhat selfless request, the soldiers beat him up and left him lying outside the inn with his pants down. After they left, Marie rushed to check on him, and he apologized for letting them get away with her money. She told him it didn't matter and assured him that she could care for herself. A little while later, Kageno packed his bags and bid Marie farewell, but she told him to keep his money when he tried to pay for his boarding. After leaving Marie's place, Kageno got himself arrested so he could experience prison. He enjoyed their meals, hid behind crates to watch prisoners beat each other up, and recreated the impel down arc when he got bored. Once he was a free man again, he joined the volunteer army, but they were nearly wiped out. He had to assume his shadow persona to save their sorry asses, but a bunch of old farts took all the glory for themselves. Days later, as he grumbled about his failed escapades, he stumbled upon the hideout of the soldiers who beat him up at Marie's place. The men were talking about a rumor that some treasure had been found in the mountains. While they were discussing, he slipped in like the angel of death and sent them to meet Hades before taking all their money. After leaving the hideout, he went to Marie's inn and dropped a bag of gold coins outside her door. When Marie found the coins, she was surprised, but after seeing Shadow, she felt relieved, thinking he'd been watching over her the entire time. In the forest, Victoria was engaged in a heated battle with the cult members. Their leader couldn't believe she had taken out his elite forces all by herself and began to wonder if she was some kind of monster. However, the battle had weakened her, so he kicked her to the ground, promising to torture her until she died. Just then, Victoria noticed Shadow through the reflection of the man's sword and began to laugh. Before he could make sense of her behavior, she was enveloped in a purple light and all her wounds healed. Immediately, she got up and sliced him in half while praising Shadow for coming to her rescue like he'd done before. Shadow had also healed the others and they were surprised when they saw him float down. Victoria, on the other hand, was thrilled to see him, and she wasted no time in telling him that Rose had betrayed them. However, he had no idea who she was talking about because Victoria used Rose's shadow garden number to refer to her. 664 and 665 tried to defend Rose, saying that Victoria had no right to call her a traitor because she only did what she did to protect her mother. While the girls argued, a page from the newspaper floated down, and when Shadow caught it, the first thing he saw was the announcement that Rose was to marry Perv-Ashat in a few days. This sent him into a fit of rage as he couldn't believe she had gone back to the same man that she had boldly rejected and stabbed. His anger caused his magical energy to swirl around him, and before the girls could stop him, he flew off towards the royal capital. As they watched him go, the girls believed he'd stormed off to make Rose pay for her betrayal. However, that wasn't the case. It turned out that their beloved lord was pissed because if Rose married that inept douchebag, he wouldn't be able to carry out his plan to turn her into the tyrant queen, so he was determined to stop the wedding. The next day, Kageno walked around the royal capital thinking of a way to get into the palace without being seen. By the time he got close to the gate, he'd already decagenoed to use a teleportation spell, but before he could activate it, Epsilon called out to him from a carriage. Since she was on her way to the palace to give a piano performance, he decagenoed to tag along as her +1. As they walked together, Epsilon chatted away happily about how glad she was that he taught her how to play the piano. She wasn't aware that Kageno wasn't paying attention, as all he couldn't think about was the feeling of her fate plots against his arm. When he sarcastically commented on them, the dumb broad thanked him for his choice of words. She then informed him that their spies were already in position and keeping a close eye on Rose. Just as she was about to say more, Ashtat and his entourage approached them and began talking about how he couldn't wait to hear her performance later on. Epsilon, playing the part of a humble pianist, thanked him for his words and said she hoped her music would give Rose some solace, since she was still mourning her father's loss. Ashtat told her that Rose was feeling under the weather, and as such wouldn't attend the luncheon that afternoon. As he rambled on about how he wanted only the best for Rose, Kageno just kept thinking about how much of an entitled piece of shit he was. He reminded him of Zenon, who acted like a saint to everyone around even though he was bad deep down. Soon enough, Ashtat noticed him standing behind Epsilon like the perfect NPC and asked Epsilon who he was. Epsilon told him Kageno was her pupil and asked if they had a problem with the fact that she'd brought him along as her guest. Ashtat explained that due to certain reasons, they didn't allow every Tom, Dick, and Harry waltz into the palace, but if Kageno were to play a piece on the piano for them, they would let him stay. As Kageno sat in front of the piano, he noticed the nobles wore expensive jewelry and wondered how selfish they must be since most of the kingdom was living impoverished. When he began playing the piano, he'd occasionally to get justice for the people by channeling his inner Robin Hood and stealing the jewelry from their bodies without them realizing it. The fact that they were completely enchanted by how he played was another reason they didn't realize they were being robbed. To everyone listening, Kageno was the reincarnation of Mozart, so when he concluded his piece, they gave him a round of applause. Ashtat even called him a musical genius and asked what his name was. Before Kageno could respond, Epsilon cut him off, saying she would formally introduce him to the public once he'd completed his training. While she was speaking to Ashtat, Kageno used his X-ray vision to scan Ashtat and discovered he had a ring in his pocket, so he pulled a swipper and stole it, using his threads. Once he was alone with Epsilon, he told her that he wanted to see more of the palace, and she quickly deduced that he wanted to look around for Rose. Before she could respond to his statement, Margaret, the maid serving them tea, eagerly got in Kageno's face and told him she'd love to give him a tour of the palace. Kageno refused her offer, but Margaret was insistent and told him she would show him the best spots in the palace. It wasn't until she mentioned that she was Rose's personal servant that he agreed to go with her, because he hoped to get some information from her. As they walked around the garden, Margaret talked about how she loved one piece. How she loved the piece he'd played earlier. She said the nobles would sell their souls to have him as their personal pianist, and even gave him a rough estimate of how much he'd make in a year. Hearing this, Kageno wondered if he should become a full-time pianist, as the money would be enough to fund his lifestyle as the eminence in shadow. However, when Margaret began acting a little too clingy for his liking, he changed the topic and asked about Rose. Margaret didn't like this and admitted that she didn't want to speak about the princess because she detested her. She said everyone used to love Rose even though she had chosen to become a Dark Knight. However, all that changed when she murdered her father. His death had plunged the kingdom into war and everything was in shambles. Yet Rose hadn't shown remorse for what she'd done. When she finished explaining the reason for her hatred, moved closer to him, asking if he wanted to know where Rose was. Like before, Kageno became uncomfortable, but the clueless girl didn't notice and kept talking until she let it slip that Rose had been locked away in a tower, just like Rapunzel. Upon hearing this, Kageno quietly slipped away from her, but before he could go far, a guard whose stomach was as large as a bear's stopped him. He did this so he could warn Kageno to stay away from Margaret, because he thought Kageno was interested in her. It turned out that the walking cholesterol storage was in love with the maid, and somehow, he deluded himself into believing she shared his feelings. While he fantasized about his love, Kageno snuck away and climbed up to the balcony of Rose's tower. When she saw him, she rushed outside to hug him, saying she'd missed him so much, and Kageno told her the feeling was mutual. After she invited him inside, he asked why she was getting married to Ashtat, and she told him she didn't want to talk about it. Kageno argued that she would be making a mistake if she married Ashtat, and reminded her that she'd murdered her father because of the same fool she was going to marry. He also told her that she was giving up on her dreams just so she could play house with a guy whose breath smelled like a boy's locker room. But Rose told him that his pea-sized brain wouldn't understand her reasons even if she explained it to him. She begged him to forget about her and move on with his life, since she assumed he was trying to stop her wedding, because he was madly in love with her. Later on, Ashat visited Rose because he'd been informed that she was speaking to someone. Rose told him she'd been alone, and when he noticed she'd been crying, he tried to touch her face, but she smacked his hand away. Annoyed, he grabbed her throat and squeezed as he reminded her that she had to do everything he asked, because her dear mother's life was on the line. Unknown to them, Kageno was sitting outside on the balcony, listening to their conversation, and after they left the room, he devised another plan to stop their wedding. Before he walked away, he pulled out the ring he'd stolen from Ashat, and wondered if it was the ring Ashat intended to give Rose on their wedding day. Later that day, Epsilon spoke to Victoria about Rose, and what happened at the ruins. She said they couldn't do anything about the situation now that Kageno had taken matters into his hands. However, she was more worried about the ring the cult had found in the ruins because it was a deadly artifact. According to legend, the ring had been used by the Oriana Kingdom to activate the Black Rose, which wiped out the troops of an enemy kingdom trying to take the royal capital. If the cult had Kageno to use it, they would erase the kingdom of Oriana from the face of the earth, and they had to prevent that. Just then, Kageno walked into the room, so the girls halted their conversation and began tending to him. While they did that, he informed them that the situation with Rose would be handled sooner than expected, earning himself praise from Epsilon and a look of pure admiration from Victoria. Meanwhile, at the palace, Ashat was on a call with Mordred, and he assured him that everything was going as planned. Mordred was pleased with this and said that once they had the power of the Black Rose, their authority within the cult would increase. He warned Ashat to be careful because he knew Shadow Garden would attempt to get the ring back, and Ashat assured him that it would never happen. He showed Mordred the ring's box as proof that he never went anywhere without it, not realizing it was empty. The next day, after Kageno's performance, he had a chat with Epsilon, and she mentioned something about the Black Rose. Kageno recalled that the incompetent upstarts who took the glory after he saved the volunteer army had gone around calling themselves the Black Rose Brotherhood. However, he had no idea what the Black Rose was, so he told Epsilon he would like to see the real thing, which surprised her. But she said if it was what wished for, they would make it happen. As always, Kageno, the clueless idiot, assumed Epsilon was putting on a show because he didn't understand why she was reacting that way over a flower. Later, Kageno made his way to the queen's room by walking along the castle walls like Spider-Man. When he got there, he was surprised to find the queen and Ashat kissing, and to make the plot twist more interesting, the two were talking about disposing of Rose. From their discussion, he learned that Ashat had convinced the stupid woman that he would marry her after he got rid of her daughter. Disgusted by what he'd witnessed, Kageno left, but to Kageno that the only way to get his plan back on track was to ensure that Rose found out that her dear mother was a shameless skank and a backstabber. Later that evening, he visited Rose dressed as Shadow and asked her to come with him so he could show her the truth. Rose followed him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, only to receive the shock of a lifetime when she discovered her mother and fiancé in a very intense workout session. As they were locked in a passionate embrace, the queen said she was glad she'd helped him drug her late husband so he could control him like a puppet. She also said they should have gotten rid of Rose right from the start because leaving her alive has caused them nothing but problems. Poor Rose, shocked by what she was seeing and the words coming out of her mother's mouth, deposited the contents of her stomach on the ground where she stood. She refused to accept that her dear mother was so sausage-whipped that she'd betrayed their family, but the truth was staring her in the face. Shadow advised her to accept it and let it fuel her desire for revenge, but as he was speaking, Rose passed out. Later, she woke up in her room and began asking herself if all the lives that had been lost because of Ashat's desires had been worth it. When she remembered her father, she began sobbing uncontrollably, wishing she could go back to the time when she was happy. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a piano coming from outside, and when she opened the doors, she found Kageno playing the piano on her balcony. She approached him and asked if he would run away with her to a place where no one would find them. Instead of giving her a simple answer, Kageno gave her a long-ass speech and told her not to lose sight of what mattered. As soon as he said this, he vanished, and what remained in his place was the ring he stole from Ashat. Rose picked it up, assuming he'd left it for her, but the truth was that he had no idea it had fallen out of his pocket. When he discovered it was missing later on, he wasn't bothered about it. While he was taking a bath, Epsilon joined him, and he told her that he'd given Rose the key, which surprised her. Kageno had no idea Epsilon was surprised, because the ring was an actual key. so he declared that the decisive battle would happen in 3 days. 3 days later, Ashat got ready for the wedding, and as he held the ring box in his hand, he told himself that the long wait was almost over. If the late king hadn't transferred ownership of the ring from himself to Rose, he wouldn't have had to marry her to take ownership of it. Nevertheless, he was glad things were about to end and decided to open the box to gaze at the ring of power. Unfortunately, the box was as empty as your ex's head. He was so shocked that he closed the box and opened it again, as if the ring would magically reappear inside it. Just as he began panicking, Mordred called to congratulate him on their upcoming victory. But Ashat didn't have the nerve to tell him that he'd lost the ring. After Mordred got off the call, Ashat told himself that he would search for the ring after the wedding and come up with an excuse to delay the plans the cult had for the kingdom. When it was time for the ceremony to begin, the nobles gathered in the chapel and Rose walked in alone since her stupid-ass mother preferred to take a nap rather than walk her daughter down the aisle. At the altar, the priest asked Ashat the necessary questions, and he said yes, but when it was Rose's turn, she said no. Ashat was shocked, but Rose didn't care about his feelings and said she was prepared to face the consequences of her actions. However, she was also going to hold him accountable for his crimes against the former king and plotting to overthrow the government. Ashat demanded that she give proof of the things she was accusing him of, and Rose said she had none. Ashat got mad and told her to stop playing silly games, reminding her that her mother's life was on the line if she refused to go through with the wedding. Still, Rose stood by her decision and pulled out the ring Cageno had left behind. She then swore by it that she would never give up on true love, after which she put it on her finger. Suddenly, a bright light shone from the ring and a recorded message from the late king popped up. In the recording, the king revealed that Ashat had been drugging and that he wanted to control the kingdom. He said Ashat belonged to an evil organization and that if he kicked the bucket, Rose was to ascend the throne. He asked everyone to trust Rose, as she knew what was best for the kingdom, and to conclude the message, he told Rose that he loved her. After the scream went off, Ashat accused Rose of fabricating the recording, but to his surprise, the nobles began chanting the words Ashat is a traitor. This was because they were informed that the king's recording had also been seen by the citizens, so they wanted nothing to do with him. Rose then took out her sword and delivered justice. By cutting off Ashat's head. The head rolled off the altar and stopped at her mother's feet, causing the woman to scream. However, her irritating screams were stopped when an unknown person sliced her head off. The next moment, Mordred spoke up as he stabbed the priest to death and introduced himself to a confused Rose and the ninth member of the rounds. Before she could respond, he used the device in his hand to control Rose's ring to release a beam of light into the sky. The clouds then took the form of the Black Rose. And from it emerged a creature Mordred referred to as Ragnarok. The creature began using a black beam to destroy the city, and all Rose could do was watch. Suddenly, one of Ragnarok's arms was severed in Cageno. Now dressed as Shadow revealed himself, surprising both Rose and Mordred. Annoyed that Cageno had injured it, Ragnarok summoned its underlings to assist it on its path of destruction. Mordred then asked Cageno who he was since he had piqued his curiosity, and Cageno introduced himself as Shadow. As he did this, the remaining wedding guests, who turned out to be members of Shadow Garden, took to the skies to fight the monsters. Rose just stood there conflicted, but Cageno assured her that he could handle things on his own and told her to go do what she had to do. He then returned his attention to Ragnarok. And as they fought, Beat and Epsilon approached Mordred. They'd promised they were going to send him to the gates of the underworld, so he attacked them with his invincible sword. Even though the attack had taken them by surprise, they weren't fazed and mocked him for relying on artifacts belonging to elves. They also called him a pitiful excuse of a man and promised to take back the artifacts, which pissed him off. When he tried to attack again, they blocked his strike and showed him the true meaning of a sword fight. Meanwhile, as Rose ran out of the chapel, she cut down the hideous minions in her path. When she noticed that Shadow Garden was already handling the monsters heading to town, she decided to fall back. Just then, Margaret ran up to her, so she ordered her to gather all the castle's residents and take them to the underground cellar. Above, Shadow and Ragnarok fought, but while the creature used everything in its arsenal to attack, Shadow just flew around, ensuring that he didn't get hit. When he narrowly escaped getting incinerated by one of Ragnarok's beams, he decayed Juno to restrain the creature using threads. Back on the ground, Rose ordered the soldiers to assist Shadow Garden and ensure that they got the people to safety. The moment they left, a badly injured Mordred fell from the sky, surprising her as she'd expected him to be a strong person. Epsilon and Beta weren't far behind, and they mocked Mordred for being too weak to fight them without his sword and armor. Mordred argued that he still had the upper hand since no one could defeat Ragnarok, and it would surely destroy them. The girls told him they were happy to wait for the giant lizard to come for them, but asked that he confirm a few things for them while they waited. They wanted to know about the cult, the Black Rose, and the magical beasts coming through it. Mordred didn't want to say anything, but they told him that he had nothing to fear since he was sure Ragnarok would beat them. Taking the bait, Mordred began spilling the beans, and he told them about the existence of other worlds. He said the cult was observing these other worlds as they wanted to learn more about them. From their research, they had learned that the worlds occasionally collided with each other. Using their world as an example, he told them that the only reason magic existed there was because a collision occurred. According to him, the collision had caused the extinction of dinosaurs because they couldn't adapt to the magic that flowed into their world from the other. The human race was the only one who adapted, but the cult suspected that the humans came from a different world entirely. Further research has also shown that some things have gone out of their world to countless other worlds without leaving a trace behind. The proof of that was Atlantis, which suddenly disappeared one day without a trace and still hadn't been found. Beta then asked if the demon Diablos had come from another world, to which Mordred responded yes. He also told them that the Black Rose was a gate to another world, and the first time it had been opened, the Oriana Kingdom made a deal with the cult to close it and get rid of the monster that came through it. In return, they asked that the king give them Rose since her blood had a high magical affinity, but her father refused. Mordred claimed that his refusal was what led to the kingdom's destruction, and he swore they would build a better one in its place. Rose said she wouldn't let them destroy what her father fought hard to protect, but Mordred told her it wasn't her decision to make. While he was going on about how they were at his mercy, Ragnarok's arm fell on top of him. This caused them to look up just as Shadow used his threads to cut Ragnarok to pieces before it went up in flames. Mordred couldn't believe a creature as strong as Ragnarok had been defeated by someone he considered a worthless sack of bones. Eventually, he stuck his head inside Ragnarok's arm and used his magic to merge his body with it. The result was a hideous mix of a wasp and a human, and he challenged Shadow to a fight. Even though Shadow already knew what the outcome of the match would be, he humored Mordred. After playing with him for a while, he used his ultimate spell, Atomic, to get rid of Mordred.
I'm atomic. Huh?
The spell was so powerful that it lit up the night sky with a blinding purple light, and when the light disappeared, Shadow remained floating in the air, looking as regal as ever. However, before he could float down to the girls, the Black Rose began closing, and he was sucked into it. Back in his former world, Nishino left her military camp, saying she was going in search of her friends who were missing. It so happened that since Kageno died, the world had gone to shit and people were struggling to survive in the post-apocalyptic world. As Nishino walked around, she sensed that she was being followed. But when she turned to check, she didn't see a soul. However, she bumped into the man who'd kidnapped her before. This time around, he looked like a low-budget Terminator on the fritz, and when she tried to escape, his blonde partner knocked her out. Like the last time, they took her to a warehouse and revealed that their employer wanted them to bring her in alive. Unlike the last time, the blondie was calm while his partner tried to strangle Nishino to death because he mistook her for Minoru. As she struggled against him, the roof of the warehouse was blown off, and Shadow dropped down. The cyborg tried to attack him but lost, so the blondie demanded to know who he was, and he introduced himself as Shadow, the one who lurked in the shadows to hunt the shadows. What do you think happened to Kageno's former world? Do you think he would ever return to his friends? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Also, if you love anime recaps as much as we do, you can check out our other videos.